Good evening. Welcome back. Gentle. Tonight, Rome's third king. His name was Tullus Hostilius. After Numa's temples came Tullus's armies. Thoughtful, Rome had been peaceful for 43 years. Too peaceful, some said. The young men wanted glory. The old men wanted expansion. Everyone wanted a king who remembered that Rome was born fighting. They found him. A man who believed war was Rome's purpose and peace was just preparation for the next battle. So settle in. Let the night wrap around you. Let Rome's story continue its patient march through the centuries. Gentle, this is the warrior king's reign. Let's begin. The coronation happened quickly. No long deliberation like with Numa. No journey to distant cities to persuade reluctant candidates. No philosophical debates about what kind of king Rome needed. The Senate knew what it wanted, and Tullus Hostilius was standing right there, practically vibrating with readiness. The ceremony took place in the Forum on a cold morning that smelled like possibility and sharpened metal. The augurs read the omens. Birds flew in acceptable patterns. The sacred chickens ate their grain with enthusiasm. Thunder rumbled distantly despite clear skies. Jupiter approved, or at least didn't object loudly enough to stop the proceedings. Tullus stood in the center of the forum wearing armor instead of robes. Not ceremonial armor, actual bronze plate that had seen use, that bore small dents and scratches from training. He wanted everyone to understand immediately what kind of king he would be. Numa Marcius, the Pontifex Maximus, performed the religious portions of the ceremony with the careful professionalism of a man who understood he was crowning someone who would probably ignore him for the next 3 decades. He blessed Tullus with appropriate prayers, called on the gods to grant wisdom and strength, and managed not to sigh audibly when Tullus shifted impatiently during the longer invocations. "Do you accept the burden of kingship?" Numa Marcius asked, using the traditional formula. "Will you guide Rome with wisdom and justice? Will you serve the gods and the people with equal devotion?" "I will serve Rome," Tullus said, editing the oath to something he could actually commit to. Not wisdom or justice, or equal devotion, just service. Simple, direct, honest, in its way. And the crowd cheered, not the polite, measured approval they'd given Numa. This was something louder, rawer, more visceral. Relief, mostly. The young men especially, they shouted themselves hoarse, celebrating the end of enforced peace, the return to a Rome they recognized from stories their grandfathers told. Tullus was crowned with a laurel wreath, victor's crown, not the oak leaves Numa had worn. Another signal, another declaration of intent. "Rome has been at peace long enough," Tullus said, addressing the crowd with the confidence of someone who'd been planning this speech for years. "We've built temples, established priests, reformed calendars, all valuable, all necessary. I won't tear down what Numa created, I'm not a fool. The gods matter, rituals matter, all of that continues." He paused, letting them absorb that, letting the priests relax slightly. "But Rome wasn't built to be peaceful," Tullus continued, his voice rising. "Rome was built to be strong, to grow, to remind our neighbors why they should fear us and our allies, why they should respect us. We've rested for 43 years, we've caught our breath. Now it's time to stand up and walk forward again." The crowd roared. This was what they wanted to hear, permission to be what they'd been trained to be. Validation that their restlessness wasn't weakness but appropriate hunger. "We'll honor the gods," Tullus said. "We'll maintain the festivals, tend the fires, consult the augurs, but we'll also remember that Mars is a Roman god too. That strength isn't something to apologize for. That Rome's destiny isn't to sit on these 7 hills and contemplate the divine. It's to grow, to expand, to become everything Romulus dreamed when he first marked these boundaries." It was a good speech. Carefully constructed to reassure the priests while exciting the warriors, to promise continuity while delivering change, to honor Numa's legacy while making clear that legacy wasn't a cage. Numa Marcius listened and thought, "We're going to war within 6 months." He was optimistic. It took 3. Tullus's first act as king was to tour the city's defenses. Not the temples, he'd get to those eventually, when he had time, when religious obligations couldn't be postponed any longer. But first, the walls, the gates, the armories, the Campus Martius, where soldiers trained, the practical infrastructure of a city that might need to defend itself, or more likely attack someone else. He walked the walls with a critical eye, noting weak points, areas that needed reinforcement. sections where an enemy could potentially breach. Rome's fortifications had been maintained during Numa's reign. The old king wasn't naive enough to leave the city vulnerable, but they hadn't been improved, expanded, or modernized. "We'll need to extend here," Tullus said, pointing to the section of wall near the Quirinal Hill, "and reinforce the gates. These are adequate for keeping out bandits, not for resisting a serious siege." "Are we expecting a serious siege?" one of the engineers asked nervously. "We're expecting everything," Tullus said. "Hope for peace, prepare for war. Numa taught us the first part. I'll handle the second." He visited the armories and found them adequate but not impressive. Enough spears and shields for Rome's current military, but no surplus, no reserves for rapid expansion. The armor was well maintained, but old, much of it dated from Romulus's time. Preserved carefully but not replaced. "We need new equipment," Tullus declared. "New bronze, new weapons. I want every man in Rome equipped properly, and I want enough reserves that we can arm allies or conscripts if needed." "That's expensive," the quartermaster said carefully. "So is losing a war because our soldiers are using their grandfather's armor," Tullus replied. "Find the money, raise taxes if you must, cut spending on festival decorations. The temples don't need gold leaf, they need the city they're in to survive." The quartermaster made notes and wondered if he should consult Numa Martius about raiding the religious budget, decided against it. Better to find money elsewhere than to start Tullus's reign with a conflict between military and religious priorities. The Campus Martius, the Field of Mars, received Tullus's most attention. This is where Rome's soldiers trained, where the Salal practiced their dances, where young men learned to be warriors or priests or occasionally both. Tullus watched the training exercises with a critical eye that found them wanting. "They're sloppy," he said to the current military commander, not old Hostilius, who had died 2 years before Numa, but a younger man named Clulius, who had learned warfare more from books than battles. "Their formations are loose, their timing is off, they've been training to look good, not to fight well." "They've had no wars to fight," Clulius said defensively. "We've maintained readiness as best we could, but theory only goes so far." "Then it's time they learnt practice," Tullus said. "Double the training schedule. I want formations drilled until they're automatic. I want these men able to hold a shield wall in their sleep. And I want combat exercises, actual fighting with blunted weapons, not just choreographed movements. Some will be injured." "Better injured in training than dead in battle," Tullus interrupted. "The Salai can keep dancing, that's fine, but the regular soldiers need to remember they're soldiers, not performers." He established new training regimens immediately. Longer hours, harder exercises, more realistic combat simulations. The young men loved it. Finally, someone taking them seriously as warriors rather than as sacred dancers or festival participants. Finally, a king who understood what they were for. The older veterans were more cautious. They remembered actual wars, remembered that training was the easy part, remembered that Tullus's enthusiasm might feel different once people started dying, but they kept those thoughts to themselves. Rome had chosen a warrior king. Now everyone would discover what that meant. Tullus did visit the temples. Eventually, about 2 months into his reign, when Numa Martius sent increasingly pointed reminders that the king had religious obligations that couldn't be indefinitely postponed, he toured them methodically. The Temple of Janus with its perpetually open doors, the Temple of Vesta where 6 virgins tended eternal flame, the smaller shrines to Jupiter, Mars, Quirinus and the dozen other gods Numa had established cults for. "They're well maintained," Tullus observed, walking through the Temple of Jupiter. Numa built solidly. He built with the expectation they'd last centuries, Numa Martius said. Not just his reign, but beyond. These are Rome's spiritual foundation. "I understand," Tullus said. And he did understand, intellectually. Temples were important. Gods mattered. Rituals served a purpose. He wasn't an idiot or a barbarian. He knew you couldn't just ignore the divine and expect good results. He just found it all profoundly boring. The endless festivals, the complicated ceremonies, the precise requirements for each sacrifice, the sacred calendar with its dozens of holy days that interrupted more useful activities, all of it felt like bureaucracy applied to the supernatural. Necessary, perhaps, but not interesting, not urgent, not the kind of thing that made his blood move faster or his purpose feel clear. "I'll maintain everything," Tullus assured Numa Martius. "The festivals continue, the Vestals keep their fire, the priests get their funding, nothing changes. Except you," Numa Martius said quietly. "Except me," Tullus agreed. Numa attended every festival personally, consulted with priests constantly, made religion central to his kingship. I won't do that. I'll fulfill my obligations, but I won't pretend to be something I'm not. Rome needs a warrior right now. The priests can handle the sacred duties without me hovering over them constantly. The gods notice, Numa Marcius warned. They pay attention to who honors them personally and who treats worship as an obligation to be delegated. Then the gods will have to adjust their expectations, Tullus said. Not disrespectfully but firmly. I'll honor them through action, through making Rome strong enough to build them better temples, through victories that prove their favor, through ensuring the city they protect is worth protecting. That's the devotion I can offer honestly. Numa Marcius wanted to argue, wanted to explain that it didn't work that way, that gods demanded personal attention regardless of how useful you were making yourself elsewhere. That neglect had consequences even when intentions were good. But Tullus was already moving on, already thinking about the next training exercise, already planning campaigns he hadn't yet announced. So Numa Marcius said nothing, just made a note to increase the frequency of propitiatory sacrifices, and hoped Jupiter was feeling patient. The gods, in his experience, rarely were. 3 months into Tullus's reign, the first real crisis arrived. Send soldiers, he said when the dispute was brought to his attention. Make it clear where our boundary is. If the Albans want to contest it, they can do so officially rather than through farmer proxies. But the treaty, one senator began. The treaty was negotiated under Numa, Tullus said, with a Rome that was peaceful and non-threatening. We're still honoring it. I'm not declaring war, I'm just clarifying boundaries. With armed clarification certainly, but clarification nonetheless. The soldiers were sent. They marked the boundary clearly, favouring Roman claims where the line was ambiguous. They escorted the Alban farmers back across what was now definitely Roman land. They made it clear that future disputes would be resolved similarly, with force, not negotiation. Alba Longa protested, sent ambassadors, complained about Roman aggression, about betrayal of alliance, about Tullus's disregard for the careful diplomacy Numa had established. Tullus received the ambassadors politely but unmoved. Rome is clarifying its borders, he said. If Alba Longa disagrees with where those borders lie, we can negotiate. But the starting position is Rome's claim, not some imaginary middle ground. We're not going to compromise our territory for the sake of keeping everyone comfortable. This isn't how Numa governed, the lead ambassador said. No, Tullus agreed. It isn't. Numa governed during peacetime. I'm governing during something else. Not war, not yet. But not the same Rome that accepted being weak for the sake of being liked. The ambassadors left unsatisfied. Alba Longa began reinforcing its own borders. Other Latin cities watched nervously, wondering if Rome under Tullus would honour the network of alliances Numa had so carefully constructed. The answer, they were starting to realise, was only when convenient. Back in Rome, the young warriors were thrilled. Finally, action. Finally, a king who understood that sometimes the correct answer to where's the boundary was where our soldiers say it is. The priests were less thrilled. Numa Marcius increased the frequency of sacrifices to Jupiter and Mars, trying to maintain divine favour while Rome's new king tested exactly how far he could push before something pushed back. In the grove beneath the Aventine hill, Egeria's spring kept flowing. No one visited it anymore. No one consulted her about whether Rome was making wise choices, or just powerful ones. The spring didn't mind. Springs are patient. They know that eventually, everyone who ignores them returns, usually desperate, usually too late, but returns nonetheless. Rome was strong again, confident again, remembering what it felt like to be feared. The temples stood, the priests performed their rituals, the calendar organized time. All of Numa's infrastructure continued functioning quietly in the background. But in the foreground, something else was happening. Something older than temples, more primal than festivals, more urgent than sacred time. Rome was waking up, stretching, remembering it had claws. And across the border, Alba Longa watched nervously and wondered if the alliance with Rome was about to become something else entirely. Something sharp. Alba Longa sat in the Alban hills, like a memory Rome couldn't quite forget. The mother city. The place where everything began, or at least where everything Roman began after the Trojan ships landed and Aeneas stopped wandering. Ascanius had founded it centuries ago, Aeneas's son, the boy who'd shot Numanus during the siege and heard Apollo's prophecy. The city where Romulus and Remus's grandfather Numitor had ruled before his brother's betrayal. The city that gave birth to the twins who would eventually give birth to Rome. Family, in other words. Complicated family, certainly, but family nonetheless. And now Rome and Alba Longa were arguing over cattle and boundaries like relatives who'd stopped speaking at a wedding years ago and couldn't quite remember why they were angry, but were committed to staying that way. The border dispute festered through Tullus's first year as king. Small provocations on both sides, farmers moving boundary stones, soldiers escorting those farmers a little too aggressively, ambassadors delivering complaints with barely concealed threats. Nothing that rose to the level of actual war, but nothing that felt like peace either. Just two cities circling each other warily, wondering who would blink first. Alba Longa had a new leader too. His name was Gaius Clulius, not related to Rome's Clulius, just one of those coincidences history sometimes enjoys. He was older than Tullus, more cautious, more diplomatic. The kind of leader who believed problems could be solved through negotiation if everyone just tried hard enough and no one got emotional. He was about to discover that Tullus was always emotional and never tried that hard. The crisis came, as these things do, over something absurd. A cow. Specifically, a very expensive breeding cow that belonged to an Alban farmer but wandered onto what Rome now claimed was Roman territory. Roman soldiers confiscated it. The Alban farmer complained to Alba Longa. Alba Longa demanded its return. Rome refused, claiming the cow had been grazing illegally and was therefore legitimate seizure. A cow. Empires have started wars over less, but somehow the cow made it all feel petty and ridiculous and inevitable at the same time. Gaius Clulius sent another embassy to Rome. More official this time, with priests and witnesses, and all the ceremonial weight that was supposed to make demands feel like reasonable requests between allies. The cow must be returned, the lead ambassador said, standing in Rome's forum with the patient exhaustion of someone who'd been having this argument for months. It belonged to an Alban citizen. Roman soldiers took it without cause. This violates the treaty Numa negotiated, the treaty that guarantees mutual respect and fair treatment. The cow was on Roman land, Tullus replied. He was seated. Kings got to sit while ambassadors stood, one of those small power moves that diplomacy was built on. Your farmer let it wander across the boundary. That's his problem, not ours. The boundary is disputed. It's not disputed, Tullus interrupted. Rome has marked where the boundary lies. If Alba Longa disputes it, then we have a different conversation. But until then, the cow grazed on Roman territory, and is therefore Roman property. The ambassador took a slow breath, trying to maintain diplomatic composure. King Tullus, surely we can find a reasonable solution. Return the cow, negotiate the boundary properly through the fetiales as tradition requires. The fetiales served Numa's approach to diplomacy, Tullus said, which involved endless talking and careful feelings and making sure everyone felt heard. I appreciate that approach. It worked for him, but I prefer clarity. Rome has claimed its boundary. If Alba Longa wants to contest that claim, contest it. Send soldiers, make your case through force, and we'll see whose claim the gods support. But I'm not negotiating away Roman territory for the sake of keeping one cow dispute from feeling tense. Silence settled over the forum. The watching crowd, citizens, senators, priests, held very still, trying to process what their new king had just done. He'd essentially invited Alba Longa to start a war over a cow, while simultaneously making it impossible for Alba Longa to back down without looking weak. The ambassador understood what had just happened. His face went carefully neutral, the way faces do when the person behind them is screaming internally but can't show it. I will convey your position to Gaius Clulius, he said quietly. Please do, Tullus said, and convey also that Rome values its alliance with Alba Longa. We're not seeking conflict. We're simply not afraid of it either. There's a difference. The embassy departed. Tullus watched them go and felt the particular satisfaction of someone who'd just simplified a complicated situation by making it impossible to solve diplomatically. Numa Marcius, watching from the edge of the forum, thought Numa would have returned the cow. He was right. Numa would have returned the cow, negotiated the boundary, probably established a new festival celebrating Alban-Roman friendship, would have de-escalated, compromised, found a solution that let everyone save face. But Numa was dead, and Tullus was king, and the cow was staying in Rome. Alba Longa took the insult exactly as badly as Tullus had hoped. Gaius Clulius called a council of the Latin League, the network of allied cities that Numa had carefully cultivated through decades of diplomatic work. He stood before representatives from a dozen cities and made his case. Rome has changed, he said. Under Numa, they were peaceful neighbours, reliable allies. They honoured treaties, negotiated fairly, respected boundaries. But Tullus Hostilius is not Numa. He takes what he wants and dares us to stop him. He insults our ambassadors, violates our territory, and treats alliance like a temporary convenience rather than a sacred obligation. The representatives listened with varying degrees of concern. Some of them had also noticed Rome becoming more aggressive, more confident, more willing to push boundaries, literal and metaphorical. Others thought Alba Longa was overreacting to minor disputes. "What do you propose?" someone asked. "Economic pressure," Gaius Clulius said. "We stop trading with Rome, we close our markets to Roman goods, we make them feel the cost of aggression without actually going to war, show them that bullying their allies has consequences." It was a reasonable plan, measured, proportional, exactly the kind of diplomatic response Numa would have appreciated. It would also fail completely because Tullus didn't care about trade relationships as much as he cared about looking strong. The Latin League agreed to the sanctions. Not unanimously. Some cities wanted to maintain good relations with Rome regardless, but enough of them that Alba Longa could claim coalition support. The sanctions took effect immediately. Roman merchants found Alban markets closed. Goods that had flowed freely between cities for 40 years suddenly required special permits that were never quite granted. Trade routes that had been reliable became complicated and expensive. Rome's economy noticed. Not catastrophically. Rome was still relatively small, still mostly self-sufficient, but enough that merchants complained, that prices for certain goods rose, that senators started asking Tullus whether perhaps he could return the damn cow and restore normal relations. Tullus's response was to increase military training and start requisitioning grain supplies. "We're preparing for war?" one senator asked nervously. "We're preparing for possibility," Tullus said. "Alba Longa wants to pressure us economically, fine. But if economic pressure doesn't work, they'll escalate. Better to be ready." "But surely we can still negotiate." "We can always negotiate," Tullus agreed. "But we negotiate better when the other side knows we're prepared for alternatives. Weakness invites exploitation. Strength invites respect. I prefer respect." The military preparations accelerated. Rome's soldiers drilled harder, trained longer, became visibly more organized and disciplined. The Campus Martius filled with formations practicing maneuvers, shield walls forming and reforming, spearwork that was no longer decorative but purposeful. Alba Longa watched and responded by mobilizing its own forces. Both cities were now in that dangerous space between peace and war, not fighting yet, but not fighting either, preparing, positioning, waiting for someone to provide the excuse that would make open conflict feel inevitable rather than chosen. The excuse arrived in the form of a dead shepherd. No one ever quite determined whose shepherd he was, Roman or Alban. He was found on disputed territory, killed by a blow to the head, his flock scattered. Both cities claimed him as a citizen. Both cities blamed the other for his death. Rome said Alba Longa had murdered a Roman shepherd to intimidate border communities. Alba Longa said Roman soldiers had killed an Alban shepherd to justify military escalation. Both were probably lying. More likely the shepherd had been killed by bandits or wild animals, or had simply fallen and struck his head on a rock. But truth was less important than narrative, and both cities had narratives they wanted to believe. Tullus called an emergency Senate meeting. The mood was tense. Half the senators were genuinely outraged by the shepherd's death. Half were skeptical but unwilling to contradict the king's interpretation. And a small minority were quietly horrified that Rome was manufacturing a war over increasingly absurd pretexts. "This cannot stand," Tullus said, addressing the Senate with appropriate gravity. "Roman citizens must be safe on Roman land. If Alba Longa believes they can murder our people with impunity, we need to correct that misunderstanding." "But we don't know Alba Longa killed him," one brave senator pointed out. "We know he's dead," Tullus said. "We know he was on land, Rome claims. We know Alba Longa has been hostile to our shepherds and farmers for months. Whether they killed him directly or created conditions that got him killed, either way they're responsible." It was sophistry, barely disguised, but it was also the kind of sophistry that lets people who want war feel justified in starting one. "What do you propose?" Proculus asked. He was old now, had served under Romulus and Numa both, had seen enough wars to know that the righteous ones looked suspiciously similar to the cynical ones. "We demand restitution," Tullus said. "Compensation for the shepherd's death, public acknowledgement of Alba Longa's responsibility, and a renegotiation of our boundary that favours Roman claims." "They'll refuse," someone said. "I'm counting on it," Tullus replied. "When they refuse, we'll have justification for stronger measures. The Fetiales will declare war properly. All the religious requirements fulfilled, all the gods consulted, everything done according to tradition. We're not barbarians, we do this correctly." Numa Martius, present but silent till now, finally spoke. "The gods won't support a war started over manufactured grievances. The gods support Rome," Tullus said calmly. "They always have. Romulus had their favour. Numa had their favour. I'll have their favour too, because I'm serving Rome's interests, making Rome strong, ensuring the city they protect is worth protecting. That's not how divine favour works." "Then we'll discover I'm wrong," Tullus interrupted, not unkindly, "and I'll adjust accordingly. But I don't believe I am wrong. Mars wants Rome to be strong. Jupiter wants Rome to grow. The gods gave us this city, and this people, and this destiny. Refusing to fulfill that destiny out of fear of conflict seems like the greater impiety." It was a compelling argument, if you didn't think about it too hard. If you did think about it, you realized Tullus was essentially claiming that ambition was piety, and that the gods wanted whatever Rome wanted. But most people didn't think about it too hard. They wanted to believe their king, wanted to believe Rome was righteous, wanted to believe that the restlessness they'd been feeling for years wasn't just boredom and frustration, but actually destiny calling them toward glorious purpose. The Senate authorized Tullus to send a final demand to Alba Longa: restitution, acknowledgement, renegotiation. The demands were deliberately impossible, designed to be refused so Rome could proceed to war with religious propriety intact. The Fetiales were dispatched to deliver the ultimatum. They performed all the ancient rituals, declaring Rome's grievances at the border, giving Alba Longa 30 days to comply, calling on Jupiter to witness the justice of Rome's position. Everything done correctly, all the sacred protocols followed, every god given opportunity to intervene if Rome was wrong. The gods did not intervene. Or if they did, nobody noticed. Alba Longa refused the demands, exactly as expected. Gaius Cloelius sent a response that was diplomatic but firm. Alba Longa denied responsibility for the shepherd's death, rejected Rome's boundary claims, and suggested both cities submit to arbitration by the Latin League. It was a reasonable response, a peaceful response, the kind of response that might have worked with Numa. Tullus read it aloud to the Senate, and then, with appropriate solemnity, tore it in half. "Alba Longa has refused justice," he said. "They've rejected peaceful resolution. They've left us no choice but to defend Roman honor through force." This was technically complete nonsense. Alba Longa had offered arbitration, which was absolutely a peaceful resolution, but Tullus wasn't interested in arbitration. He was interested in war. The Senate voted to authorize military action. Not unanimously, some senators abstained, unwilling to support what they saw as manufactured conflict, but enough voted yes that Tullus had his mandate. The Fetiales performed the final ritual, throwing a spear across the border into Alban territory, formally declaring that Rome and Alba Longa were now at war. The spear landed in a field where, coincidentally, an expensive breeding cow was grazing. The cow, unimpressed by the historical significance of the moment, continued eating grass. Rome mobilized for its first war in 43 years. Soldiers who'd trained their entire lives but never fought sharpened their weapons, and tried not to show how nervous they felt. Veterans of Romulus's campaigns, now elderly, but still remembering, offered advice about staying alive when people were actively trying to kill you. The young men were excited. Finally, purpose, finally, the chance to prove themselves as something other than festival participants or temple builders. Finally, the opportunity to discover whether they were actually warriors, or just people who'd been pretending. Across the border, Alba Longa prepared to defend itself against the city it had mothered. Gaius Cloelius looked at his smaller army, his fewer resources, his weaker position, and understood that Rome had manufactured this war precisely because they knew they would win it. He sent one final message to the Latin League, requesting military support. Some cities promised aid. Others decided neutrality was safer than opposing Rome, Others actively sided with Rome, calculating that being allied with the aggressor was smarter than defending the victim. The politics of coalition warfare were complex and depressing. In Rome, Tullus stood on the Capitoline Hill and looked toward Alba Longa, toward the mother city, toward the place where Roman history began before Rome existed, and he planned how to destroy it. Not because he hated Alba Longa, not because they'd done anything truly unforgivable, but because Rome was growing, and growth required taking things, and Alba Longa was close and vulnerable, and had made the mistake of thinking family obligations protected them from ambition. The Temple of Janus stood with its doors open. They'd been open for 43 years, but now they felt different. Active, purposeful. Not just symbolically open, but practically open. Open because Rome was marching through them toward violence. The Vestals tended their fire and prayed for Rome's victory. The Salii danced for Mars with new intensity, knowing the god might actually be watching this time. The priests performed their ceremonies and hoped the gods understood that Rome, was still devoted, was still faithful, even while doing terrible things. In the grove beneath the Aventine Hill, Aguria's spring kept flowing. No one consulted it. No one asked whether this war was wise or just or necessary. Springs don't offer opinions anyway. They just flow, constant, patient, waiting for someone to eventually notice they exist. Alba Longa was 43 years of peace away, a generation away, a different Rome away. But distance collapses when you point an army at it. Thunder was returning. The question Rome would have to answer was simple. After 43 years of Numa's patient peace, what had Rome actually learned? And whether any of that learning would survive its first real test? The two armies met on the plain between Rome and Alba Longa on a morning that felt like the world holding its breath. Not a large plain. This was still early Rome, still small-scale warfare where a few hundred men on each side constituted a proper army, but large enough that both forces could spread out, form their lines, look across the empty grass at enemies who might have been neighbours or cousins or trading partners 6 months ago. Tullus rode along the Roman lines on a horse that seemed to understand the gravity of the moment. He wore his finest armour, bronze polished to mirror brightness, a helmet crested with red plumes, a shield painted with the image of Mars. He looked like war personified, like everything Numa had deliberately not been. Today, he called out, his voice carrying across the ranks, Rome remembers what it is. Not just a city of temples and festivals, though we honour those. Not just a place where priests consult calendars, though that matters too. Today, Rome remembers it was founded by a warrior, raised by a wolf, built by people who took what they wanted, and made no apologies. The soldiers roared approval. This was what they'd been waiting for. This was the speech that made violence feel noble, that transformed a manufactured conflict over a cow and a dead shepherd into destiny, fulfilling itself. Across the plain, Gaius Clulius gave his own speech to the Alban forces, probably something about defending their homes, about justice, about standing against aggression. The words didn't carry far enough for the Romans to hear, but the emotion did, desperation mixed with determination, the feeling of people who knew they were outmatched but were going to fight anyway. The armies advanced. Slowly at first, maintaining formation, shields overlapping, spears pointed forward. The grass between them diminished step by step until they were close enough to see each other's faces, to recognize the humanity they were about to try very hard to kill. And then something unexpected happened. Gaius Cluilius, standing at the front of the Alban line, raised his hand. The Alban army stopped advancing. Across the gap, Tullus raised his own hand, and Rome stopped too. Not because he'd planned to, but because something in Cluilius's gesture suggested this moment required attention. King Tullus, Cluilius called across the diminishing distance. This is madness. We're about to kill each other over a border dispute and a cow. Romans and Albans who share blood and history and gods. Who founded Rome? Alba Longa. Who mothered your city? We did. And now we stand ready to murder family over manufactured grievances. Tullus said nothing, just waited to see where this was going. There must be another way. Cluilius continued. His voice was steady, though whether from courage or resignation was hard to determine. Some method that doesn't require hundreds of men to die, proving points that could be proven other ways. What do you propose? Tullus asked, genuinely curious now. Yet Cluilius took a breath, then spoke the words he'd apparently been preparing since the moment war became inevitable. Champions, 3 from each side. Let them fight while both armies watch. Whichever city's champions win, that city's claims are validated. The losing city accepts the boundary where the winners mark it, pays reasonable restitution, and we all go home without decimating each other's populations. Silence rolled across both armies. Soldiers looked at each other, trying to decide if this was brilliant or insane or just desperate. Tullus considered the proposal. Part of him was disappointed. He'd been prepared for a proper battle, for the opportunity to test Rome's military strength comprehensively. But another part recognized the elegance of the solution. If Rome won, they got everything they wanted without significant casualties. If Rome lost, well, that seemed unlikely. Rome's soldiers were better trained, better equipped, more ready. 3 champions, Tullus said slowly, fighting to settlement, the gods witnessing and judging through combat. Winner takes the disputed territory and acknowledgement of righteousness. Yes, Claudius said. Do we have terms? We have terms, Tullus agreed. Choose your champions. We'll choose ours. The armies relaxed infinitesimally, not standing down exactly, but shifting from immediate combat to immediate observation. This was still violence, but contained violence, manageable violence, the kind where most people would survive to go home and tell stories. Alba Longa's choice was obvious. They had triplets, 3 brothers named Curiati, famous throughout the Latin cities for their skill in combat. They were in their mid-20s, perfectly matched in size and ability, had trained together their entire lives. They moved like parts of the same organism, understood each other's fighting styles instinctively. They stepped forward in perfect unison, and the Alban army roared approval. Rome's choice was equally obvious, and infinitely more complicated. Rome also had triplets, 3 brothers named Horatius or Horatiae, plural, sons of a prominent patrician family, also mid-20s, also trained together since childhood, also perfectly synchronized in combat. There was just one problem. One of the Horatii, the eldest, whose personal name was Publius, was engaged to marry a woman named Horatia, who was unfortunately the sister of the Horatii brothers. Let that sink in for a moment. Rome's champions were engaged to marry Alba Longa's champion's sister. The 2 families were in the process of becoming one family through marriage alliance, and now they were being asked to fight to the death while their armies watched. Publius Horatius stood with his brothers Marcus and Titus, and looked across the plain at the men who were supposed to become his brothers-in-law. The Curiatii looked back with identical expressions of grim resignation. Everyone understood what was happening. This wasn't just combat anymore. It was tragedy. It was the kind of story that would be told for centuries, specifically because of how terrible it was, how perfectly it illustrated the cost of war, how it transformed personal grief into public spectacle. We don't have to do this, Marcus Horatius said quietly to his brothers. We can refuse. Let someone else fight. And seem like cowards, Publius replied, equally quiet. And shame our family? And let Rome think we value personal comfort over civic duty? But Horatia will understand or won't, Publius said. Either way, this is what Rome needs from us. This is the price of citizenship. Sometimes duty requires terrible things. It was a very Roman sentiment, very honourable, very certain that individual suffering mattered less than collective obligation, the kind of logic that builds empires and destroys souls in equal measure. The 3 Horatiae stepped forward. Across the plain, the 3 Curiatiae did the same. Both sets of triplets walked toward the centre of the field, toward the space where their futures would be decided by whose sword moved faster, whose training was more thorough, whose luck held longer. They met in the middle. For a moment, just a moment. They were close enough to speak quietly, away from the army's hearing. I would have been honoured to call you brother, one of the Curiatii said to Publius. I still think of you as brother, Publius replied. But Rome and Alba Longa are asking us to be something else right now. May the best city win, another Curiati said. May the gods forgive us all, Titus Horatius responded. They separated, returned to their starting positions, raised their shields and drew their swords. Tullus, watching from the Roman lines, felt something twist in his chest. This was what he'd wanted. Conflict, testing, the opportunity for Rome to prove its strength. But seeing it manifest as 6 young men about to kill each other, seeing the personal cost made visible and specific, it was harder than he'd expected. For just a moment he understood why Numa had preferred diplomacy. The moment passed. Rome needed this. Rome needed victory, needed validation, needed proof that Tullus's approach was correct. Personal tragedy was unfortunate, but it was also the price of greatness. A priest, not Numa, who had refused to participate in this particular ceremony, stepped forward and called on Mars to witness the combat, to judge fairly, to grant victory to the righteous side. Mars, god of war, presumably appreciated the irony of being asked to determine which side was righteous in a conflict that had been manufactured from nothing. The priest stepped back. 6 young men stood facing each other. 6 young men who should have been family, sharing meals and stories in the easy comfort of peace, instead preparing to kill each other while hundreds watched and cheered. Somewhere in the Roman crowd, a young woman named Horatia watched with her hand pressed against her mouth, trying not to scream. The combat began. The Curiati brothers had a strategy. They were outnumbered in the sense that both sides had 3 men, but they had the advantage of knowing they were defending their home, their city, everything they loved. Desperation makes people creative. They came at the Horatia together, coordinated, trying to use superior teamwork to overwhelm Rome's champions before individual skill could make the difference. It almost worked. The first clash was chaos, swords striking shields, bronze ringing against bronze, men grunting with effort and pain and fear. The Curiati fought with desperate intensity, pressing hard, trying to create openings through sheer aggressive energy. Marcus Horatius, the middle brother, took a sword thrust to the shoulder. Not fatal, but serious. He stumbled backward, blood staining his armor, his shield arm weakening. He tried to recover, to maintain formation, but one of the Curiati saw the opening and pressed the advantage. Marcus fell. Not dead immediately, but mortally wounded, blood pooling beneath him, his brothers unable to help without exposing themselves to the same fate. The Alban army roared. First blood, first kill, 1 champion down, 2 to go. The Horatii brothers absorbed the loss and kept fighting. Titus moved to cover the space Marcus had occupied, tried to maintain the defense, but the Curiatii were energized now, could smell victory, pressed harder. Titus took a slash across his leg. He staggered but stayed upright, kept fighting, kept trying to protect his remaining brother. But the wound slowed him, made him vulnerable, and the Curiatii were merciless in exploiting vulnerability. Titus fell. Still alive, barely, but out of the fight, bleeding, watching his brother face 3 opponents alone. Publius Horatius stood in a field stained with his brother's blood and faced 3 men who should have been his family. The Curiatii were wounded too, cuts and bruises from the fighting, but they were still standing, still coordinated, still 3 against 1. Rome's army had gone very quiet. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. This was supposed to be Roman victory, Roman validation, proof that Tullus's approach was correct. Instead, 1 Roman champion stood alone against 3, and the odds were terrible, and defeat was looking increasingly inevitable. Tullus watched and felt ice settle into his stomach. He'd started a war to prove Rome's strength. If Rome's champion lost, if Alba Longa won, then everything he'd done, every aggressive decision, every manufactured grievance, all of it would be revealed as nothing but arrogance meeting consequence. Publius Horatius looked at the 3 Curiatii brothers, at the men who were engaged to his sister, at the future he'd lost the moment he agreed to this combat. And then he did something unexpected. He ran. Not away from the field entirely. That would have been desertion, but backward, fast, opening distance between himself and the Curiatii. It looked like retreat, looked like cowardice. The Alban army cheered, thinking victory was assured. The Roman army groaned, watching their champion flee. But Publius wasn't fleeing. He was thinking. 3 opponents who were wounded, tired, but still together. That was impossible odds. But 3 opponents who were wounded at different severities, who would run at different speeds when chasing a fleeing enemy. That was different. That was beatable. The Curiatii pursued. As Publius had calculated, they didn't stay together. The least wounded brother ran fastest, pulling ahead of his siblings, eager to catch the fleeing Roman and end this humiliation. Publius waited until the first Curiatii was separated from his brothers by 20 paces. Then he stopped running, turned and engaged. 1-on-1, Publius was better, fresher, less wounded, more desperate. His sword found the Curiati's neck, and the first Alban champion fell. The second Curiati arrived 30 seconds later, but 30 seconds was long enough. Publius had caught his breath, had reset his stance, was ready. This Curiati was more wounded than his brother, slower, less coordinated. The fight was brief and brutal. Publius's sword found gaps in the Alba's defense that desperation couldn't close. The second Curiati fell. The third brother arrived to find his siblings dead, and the Roman champion bloodied but victorious and waiting. This Curiati, was the most wounded of the three, limping, exhausted from the chase, understanding too late that they'd been tricked. They fought anyway, because what else was there to do? Because honor demanded it. Because three brothers had walked onto this field together, and leaving alone was unthinkable. Publius Horatius killed the third Curiati quickly. Mercifully. As close to mercifully as killing can be. Then he stood in a field of bodies, his brothers dying or dead, the men who should have been his family definitely dead, and raised his bloody sword toward Rome. Rome erupted in celebration. Victory. Impossible victory snatched from certain defeat. Proof that Roman cleverness and skill could overcome any odds. Validation of Tullus's aggressive approach. Confirmation that the gods favoured Rome. Alba Longa's army stood in shocked silence. Their champions dead, their cities claimed defeated, everything they'd hoped to defend lost to one Roman's desperate strategy. Gaius Cluilius looked at the carnage and felt something break inside him. This was supposed to save his city. Instead, it had just confirmed Alba Longa's destruction. Tullus walked onto the field, past the dead and dying, and embraced Publius Horatius. The young champion was shaking adrenaline, grief, shock, the aftermath of violence settling into his body like poison. "You've saved Rome," Tullus said. "You've proven our strength. You've won everything." "Yes," Publius said quietly, looking at his dead brothers, at his dead almost brothers-in-law, at the price of everything. "I've won everything." He sounded like a man who understood that winning and surviving were not the same as being whole. The armies dispersed. Alba Longa to bury their champions and prepare for the consequences of defeat. Rome to celebrate victory and claim their champion as a hero. Medical priests tended to Marcus and Titus Horatius. Marcus was beyond saving, died on the field, never quite regaining consciousness. Titus survived, barely, but would walk with a limp for the rest of his life, and would never hold a sword again without his hands shaking. Publius was carried into Rome on soldiers' shoulders, cheered by crowds who hadn't witnessed the fight, but had heard about the victory and wanted to celebrate. He smiled and raised his arms and played the role of hero because Rome needed him to. But his eyes were distant, focused on something no one else could see. At the city gates, someone was waiting. Horatia, Publius's sister, the Curiatii brothers' sister, the woman who had just lost her fiancé, her future, everything she'd planned, because two cities couldn't negotiate a border dispute without violence. She saw her brother approaching, covered in blood, some his own, some from the men she'd loved. She saw the celebration, the joy, the complete absence of acknowledgement that anything terrible had happened, and something broke in her too. "Murderer!" she screamed, pushing through the crowd toward her brother. "Murderer! You killed him! You killed them all!" The celebration stopped. The crowd went silent. Publius, still on soldiers' shoulders, looked down at his sister with the expression of a man who had been waiting for this moment, knowing it would come, dreading it. "Horatia," he said quietly, "I did what Rome required." "Rome required you to murder my fiancé?" Her voice was raw, broken. "Rome required you to kill the men who were supposed to be our family? What kind of city demands this? What kind of brother agrees to it?" She was crying now, openly, without dignity, without the restraint Roman women were supposed to maintain in public. Just grief pouring out of her like something that had been building pressure too long and had finally exploded. "I won the combat," Publius said. "I did my duty." "Duty?" Horatia spat the word like poison. "You slaughtered your family for duty. You chose Rome over everyone who loved you, over everyone you should have loved, over everything that makes life worth living, and they're celebrating you. They're treating this horror like it's glorious." Publius climbed down from the soldier's shoulders, walked toward his sister, tried to embrace her, to comfort her, to make her understand that he'd had no choice. She pushed him away. "Don't touch me. Don't you dare touch me with hands that killed him. I hope you're satisfied. I hope victory was worth destroying everything. Horatia, please." "I curse you," she said, and her voice had gone cold now, past grief into something darker. "I curse the victory that cost this much. I curse Rome for demanding it. I curse the gods for allowing it, and I curse you, brother, for choosing all of this over family." She turned to walk away. And Publius Horatius, champion of Rome, hero of the impossible victory, man who had just saved his city from defeat, drew the sword that was still strapped to his side and drove it through his sister's back. She fell without sound. The crowd gasped. Time seemed to stop as everyone tried to process what had just happened. Publius stood over his sister's body, his sword dripping blood, hers now added to everyone else's, and said the words that would define this moment forever. "So perish every Roman woman who mourns an enemy." Then he dropped the sword and collapsed to his knees. And whether that was grief or shock, or simply the moment when his body stopped being able to carry the weight of what he'd done, no one could quite tell. Tullus watched from the forum and understood that his glorious victory had just become something else entirely. Something complicated. Something that would require explaining. Something that made Rome look less like righteous strength and more like a city that murdered its own citizens for expressing grief. The celebration died completely. People backed away from Publius Horatius, like he'd become something contagious. The hero of Rome, the killer of his sister, the man who'd saved his city and destroyed his family in the same afternoon. Someone called for the priests. Someone else called for magistrates. The body of Horatia lay in the street while Rome tried to decide what justice looked like when duty and murder tangled together into something neither law nor tradition had prepared them to handle. And in the silence, a voice, no one ever identified whose, said quietly what everyone was thinking. Perhaps Numa was right about peace. No one argued. Rome didn't know what to do with a hero who was also a murderer. The problem sat in the middle of the forum like a stone. No one wanted to move, but everyone kept tripping over. Publius Horatius had saved Rome. That was undeniable. His strategy, his skill, his willingness to face 3 opponents alone had won the combat that would have otherwise meant Rome's humiliation and defeat. But he'd also killed his sister in the street, in front of witnesses, while she was unarmed, while she was grieving. That was also undeniable, and considerably harder to justify than clever battlefield tactics. The law was clear. Murder was murder. The penalty was death. But applying the law to Rome's greatest living hero felt complicated in ways that made everyone uncomfortable. Tullus called an emergency Senate meeting that same evening. The body of Horatia had been moved, respectfully, carefully, with the kind of attention paid to problems that might explode if handled wrong. Publius had been confined to his house, not quite arrested but definitely not free. The whole city held its breath and waited to see what justice would look like when it became inconvenient. "The law is clear," one senator began. He was old, had served since Numa's time, remembered when things felt simpler. Publius Horatius killed an unarmed woman in public. That's murder. The penalty is execution. He's Rome's champion. Another senator protested. "You won the combat, saved us from humiliation. You can't execute a hero. Being a hero doesn't make you exempt from law." The first senator replied, "If anything, heroes should be held to higher standards. What kind of message does it send if Rome says murder is fine as long as you've done something useful recently?" "But she was mourning enemies," a third voice added. "She was cursing Rome. She was refusing to celebrate our victory. Isn't there something like treason in that? Something that makes her death more complicated than simple murder?" The debate spiraled outward from there. Some senators argued for execution. The law was the law, and heroes who broke it deserved punishment like anyone else. Others argued for leniency. Publius had been under enormous stress, had just killed people he loved for Rome's sake, deserved understanding for acting in a moment of grief-induced madness. Still others argued for something in between, a trial perhaps where evidence could be heard and judgment rendered properly, rather than through Senate debate. Tullus listened to all of it with growing frustration. He'd wanted simple victory, clean triumph, proof that his approach to kingship was correct. Instead, he'd gotten moral complexity, public division, and a hero whose actions made Rome look less righteous and more terrifying. "We'll have a trial," Tullus announced, cutting through the debate with royal authority. "Public, transparent, let the people see justice being deliberated. Publius Horatius will defend himself. Witnesses will testify. A verdict will be reached. Whatever it is, we'll accept it and move forward." "And if the verdict is execution?" someone asked. "Then Rome loses its greatest champion," Tullus said, "but gains confirmation that law matters more than individual greatness. That's worth something too." It was a diplomatic answer, a political answer. An answer that let everyone leave the meeting feeling like something had been decided while actually deciding nothing. The trial was set for 3 days hence. Enough time to prepare, not enough time for public opinion to solidify into something unmovable. Enough time for Publius Horatius to sit in his house and stare at his hands and try to understand what he'd done. The trial took place in the Forum under grey skies that threatened rain but never quite delivered. Rome gathered to watch patricians and plebeians, veterans and young men, women who'd lost brothers and sons to violence and women who'd only heard about it second-hand. Everyone wanted to see how this impossible situation would resolve itself. Publius Horatius stood in the centre of the Forum, flanked by guards but not chained. He wore plain clothes, no armour, no weapons, nothing that suggested hero or warrior or anything beyond citizen, accused of crime. His face was carefully empty, the expression of someone who'd decided that feeling anything was too dangerous. The presiding magistrate, a man named Tullius, unrelated to the king despite the similar name, opened the proceedings with appropriate formality. Publius Horatius, you are accused of murdering your sister Horatia in the street yesterday afternoon following your victory in the champions' combat. How do you answer this charge? I killed her, Publius said. His voice was flat, factual. She was mourning enemies of Rome, cursing our victory, choosing foreign affection over civic duty. I acted in defense of Rome's honor. A murmur ran through the crowd. It wasn't technically a confession. It was a justification that acknowledged the act while claiming it wasn't criminal. Clever, in a horrible way. Defense of Rome's honor, the magistrate repeated slowly. You believe that justified killing an unarmed woman in the street? I believe, Publius said, choosing his words carefully, that Romans who celebrate our enemies and mourn our victories are betraying everything we fight for. My sister chose her grief over her city. I chose my city over my sister. History will judge which choice was correct. It was a good answer, not morally good. Morally it was terrible, but tactically good. It reframed the murder as a political act rather than a personal one, as defense of Rome rather than loss of control. It gave people who wanted to acquit him a framework for doing so without admitting they were excusing murder. The prosecution called witnesses, people who'd been in the street, who'd seen the whole confrontation. They testified to what everyone already knew, that Horatia had been grieving. Yes, but also unarmed, that she'd been walking away when Publius struck, that this wasn't defense or necessity but choice. She was cursing Rome, one witness said, cursing all of us, saying she hoped we'd suffer for what we'd done. She was in pain, another witness countered. She'd just lost her fiancé, lost her future. She was expressing grief, not treason. The testimonies painted two completely different pictures of the same moment, and which picture you believed depended entirely on what you already thought about duty, family, grief, and the proper way for Romans to respond to loss. Then the defense called its witnesses, veterans mostly, men who'd fought under Romulus, who understood violence in ways peaceful citizens didn't, mourning the enemy as betrayal, one old warrior testified. Maybe not legal betrayal, but spiritual betrayal. When you celebrate our enemies' lives more than our soldiers' victories, you're telling us our sacrifices don't matter. That kills morale. That makes young men hesitate when they shouldn't. That gets more people killed in the long run. But she was his sister. Someone in the crowd called out, "Family doesn't excuse treason." The veteran shot back. "Family makes it worse. She should have understood what her grief cost. Should have kept it private. Should have honored her brother's victory instead of spitting on it." It was compelling if you didn't think too hard about whether expressing grief constituted treason. If you did think about it, you realized Rome was trying to make emotion itself criminal, which seemed like a dangerous precedent. Publius was allowed to speak in his own defense. He stood in the center of the forum and told his story. The combat, the deaths of his brothers, the impossible victory, the moment when his sister's curse made him choose between family and duty. "I don't ask you to forgive me," he said, and his voice finally showed emotion, exhaustion, grief, the terrible weight of having done something you can't undo. "I don't ask you to say what I did was right. I ask you to understand that sometimes Rome demands terrible choices. That duty costs everything. That being Roman means choosing the city even when the city asks you to destroy yourself." He paused, looking out at faces that were sympathetic and hostile and confused in equal measure. "I killed my brothers by fighting their future brothers-in-law. I killed my sister by choosing Rome over family. I've destroyed everyone I loved for the sake of a city that will remember my name and forget my grief. That's what Rome cost me. I paid it willingly. Now you decide whether that payment was necessary or whether I'm just a murderer who used patriotism as an excuse." He sat down. The forum was very quiet. The magistrate called for arguments to conclude. The prosecution's final statement was simple. Law applies to everyone. Heroes don't get exemptions. If we excuse this, we say that Romans can kill family members whenever we disagree with their emotions. That's not law, that's chaos. The defense's final statement was equally simple. Rome demands sacrifice. Sometimes that sacrifice includes things we love. Publius Horatius sacrificed everything for victory. He gave us his brothers, his future, his family, his peace of mind. Now we're going to execute him for completing that sacrifice. What does that teach the next generation of heroes? That service has limits? That duty stops when it becomes too costly? Both arguments were good. Both were terrible. Both were true and false simultaneously, depending on what you valued more, individual restraint or collective obligation. The magistrate looked at Tullus, who had remained silent throughout the trial. This was the king's decision, ultimately. The verdict would come from whatever signal Tullus gave about what Rome needed more, law or heroes. Tullus stood slowly. He'd been thinking about this for 3 days, weighing options, trying to decide what kind of precedent he wanted to set. Execute Publius, and Rome lost its greatest champion, and admitted that victory had cost too much. Acquit him, and Rome established that murder was acceptable if you were useful enough. The court recognizes, Tullus said carefully, that this case involves extraordinary circumstances. A citizen who served Rome beyond any reasonable expectation, who saved us from defeat, who paid terrible personal cost for that service. The crowd leaned forward. This sounded like acquittal incoming. However, Tullus continued, the law exists to constrain exactly these moments when emotion runs high, when justifications feel compelling, when we're tempted to excuse actions because we understand the motivation. If we excuse Publius, we say that strong feelings justify violence. That opens a door we may not be able to close. Now it sounded like execution. People who'd been preparing to cheer looked confused. Therefore, Tullus said, this court finds Publius Horatius guilty of murder. The sentence is death. Gasps. Outcry. The crowd erupted in competing voices, some celebrating justice, some protesting the treatment of a hero, everyone shocked that Tullus had actually done it. However, Tullus said loudly, waiting for quiet, Publius Horatius has the right to appeal to the people. Let all Roman citizens gather and vote on whether this verdict should stand. We are a city, not a monarchy. In matters this significant, the people's voice carries weight equal to law. Clever. So clever. Tullus had passed the decision to the crowd, let them feel ownership of the outcome, avoided being solely responsible for either executing or excusing a murderer. Whatever happened next, it would be Rome's choice, not just the king's. The vote was called for immediately. Every adult male citizen was invited to cast a stone white for acquittal, black for execution, the kind of direct democracy that only worked in cities small enough that everyone could fit in the forum. While the people voted, Publius stood very still and thought about his brothers, his sister, his fiancée, who would never be his wife, and wondered if death might actually be the easier option. The voting took hours. Not because the choice was difficult. Most people had decided before the trial began, but because hundreds of citizens needed to file past the voting urns, drop their stones and make their opinion known. While Rome voted, Titus Horatius Publius's surviving brother approached the magistrate. He was still injured from the combat, still limping but moving with determination. I want to speak, Titus said. The arguments have concluded. Not as a witness, Titus interrupted. As family. As the person who has the most right to be heard. The magistrate looked at Tal, who nodded. Why not? The vote was already happening. One more speech wouldn't change anything, and it might provide closure that everyone seemed to need. Titus stood where his brother had stood, and addressed Rome with the voice of someone who'd lost everything, and had stopped caring about anything except truth. My brother killed our sister, Titus said. That's true. Undeniable. Unforgivable. Probably. But before you cast your final votes, I want you to understand what we did for Rome. He gestured toward his injured leg, toward the wound that would never fully heal. Marcus is dead, killed fighting men who should have been our friends. I'll never fight again, never hold a sword without shaking. My body will remember that combat for the rest of my life, and I'll limp through Rome as a walking reminder that victory cost something. He paused, gathered himself. And Publius? Publius killed everyone. His almost brothers-in-law, his sister, his future, his peace of mind. He won everything for Rome and lost everything for himself. You're voting on whether to take the last thing he has, his life. That's fine. That's your right. But understand what you're doing. You're telling the next generation of Romans that service has a limit. That duty stops when it becomes too painful. That Rome will demand everything and then punish you for giving it. Another pause. His voice cracked but didn't break. I don't know if Publius deserves to live. I don't know if what he did was justified or murder or some terrible combination of both. But I know that if you execute him, you're telling Rome that heroes are disposable, that saving the city doesn't earn mercy, that we'll consume our champions and throw them away when their methods make us uncomfortable. He looked directly at the crowd, at individual faces, making eye contact with people who were actively voting on his brother's life. Do what you think is right, Titus said. But do it knowing that we gave Rome everything, every single thing we had, and now you get to decide if that was enough. He stepped down, limped back to his place, and waited with his brother for Rome to make its choice. The voting continued. White stones and black stones, clicking into urns, accumulating into a decision that would define how Rome understood duty, family, law, and the cost of being a champion. Finally, as afternoon light started to fade, the votes were counted. The magistrate announced the results with a voice that carried across the forum. By vote of the people of Rome, Publius Horatius is acquitted. The murder charge is dismissed. The champion of Rome is free. The crowd erupted, half in celebration, half in protest. Those who valued heroes over law cheered. Those who valued law over heroes shouted their disagreement. Everyone who'd hoped this trial would provide clear moral answers discovered instead that Rome had chosen pragmatism over principle, usefulness over justice. Publius Horatius heard the verdict and felt absolutely nothing. Relief should have come, or gratitude, or the lift of reprieve from death sentence. But there was nothing, just the vast emptiness of someone who'd sacrificed everything and survived, and wasn't sure that counted as victory. Titus embraced his brother carefully, mindful of the wounds they both carried, visible and invisible. You're free, Titus said. Am I? Publius replied quietly. They both knew the answer. Free from execution, yes. Free from what he'd done, what he'd lost, what he'd become. That was different. That was the kind of sentence that didn't end with acquittal. Tullus watched the brothers hold each other and thought about the cost of everything he'd started. The war he'd manufactured, the combat he'd allowed, the tragedy he'd enabled by choosing aggression over diplomacy. He'd wanted to prove Rome could be strong again. He'd succeeded. But strength looked different up close than it did in imagination. The crowd dispersed slowly. The trial was over. Justice had been served, or at least something that resembled justice enough that people could tell themselves they'd done the right thing. But Rome felt different now. Something had shifted. Some innocence that Numa's peace had preserved. The belief that Rome could be great without being terrible. That victory could be clean. That duty and morality aligned. That had died in the street with Horatia. Rome had chosen strength over law, usefulness over principle, the practical over the moral, and in doing so had become more itself than it had been in 43 years. That evening, Publius Horatius visited his sister's grave. She'd been buried quietly, without ceremony, in the family plot outside the city. He stood over the fresh earth and tried to find words for what he'd done, what he felt, what remained. Nothing came. Just silence and the weight of actions that couldn't be undone. I don't know if you can hear me, he said finally. I don't know if the dead care about explanations. But I need to say this. I didn't kill you because I hated you. I killed you because I loved Rome more. That's what Rome asked from me. Total devotion. Complete sacrifice. Everything. The grave offered no response. Graves rarely did. I won the trial, Publius continued. Rome decided I was justified, that what I did was acceptable, legal, necessary even. But they're wrong. I know they're wrong. What I did wasn't justice. It was murder. Rome just decided to call it something else, because my murder was more useful than my execution. A bird called somewhere in the gathering dusk. Life continuing, indifferent to human grief. I'm sorry, Publius said. For everything. For killing your future. For choosing Rome over you. For being exactly what Rome wanted me to be. I hope wherever you are it's far from here. Far from us. Far from what we've become. He turned to leave, then paused. Looked back at the grave. "You were right to curse me," he said quietly. "You were right about all of it." Then he walked back toward the city, toward the title of champion and the weight of acquittal, and the rest of his life spent remembering the afternoon when duty required him to destroy everything he loved. Behind him, the grave remained silent, but somewhere in groves, in springs, in the sacred spaces where gods paid attention, the curse Horatia had spoken was heard, and remembered, and would, eventually, bear fruit. The victory should have been. Rome had won the champion's combat. The terms were clear. The losing city would accept the winner's boundary claims, pay restitution, acknowledge defeat. Alba Longa should have simply complied, moved on, absorbed the humiliation, and adjusted to the new reality where Rome was clearly the dominant power. But nothing about this war had been clean, and the aftermath wouldn't be either. Gaius Cloelius, leader of Alba Longa, died 3 days after the combat. No one was entirely sure how. Some said grief, some said illness, others whispered poison from internal enemies who blamed him for agreeing to the champion's combat in the first place. Dead was dead, regardless of method, and Alba Longa found itself leaderless at exactly the moment it needed leadership most. The Alban council appointed a successor quickly. His name was Metius Fufetius, a military commander, shrewd and political, the kind of man who smiled while calculating how to betray you. He accepted the position of dictator and immediately sent word to Rome that Alba Longa would honor the combat's terms. The message was perfectly diplomatic, perfectly appropriate, and somehow, to anyone who knew Metius, perfectly suspicious. Tullus received the message and didn't believe a word of it. "He's planning something," Tullus said to his advisors, reading the letter for the third time, looking for hidden meanings in diplomatic language. "This is too easy, too compliant. Alba Longa just lost everything. Their champions, their leader, their honor." And Metius responds by immediately agreeing to all our demands. "He's buying time." "For what?" one advisor asked. "For alliance building," another suggested. "For convincing the Latin League that Rome is the real threat. For positioning Alba Longa as the reasonable party and us as the aggressors." "Exactly," Tullus said. "We won the combat, but we haven't won the war." "Not really. Alba Longa is wounded. But wounded animals are the most dangerous kind." He was right, as it turned out. But being right didn't make what came next any easier. Metius Fufetius spent the next 6 months doing exactly what Tullus suspected, building alliances, making promises, convincing neighboring cities that Rome under Tullus was becoming a threat to everyone's independence. He was good at it, persuasive, the kind of political operator who could make betrayal sound like pragmatic necessity. He convinced the Fidenates, a small Etruscan city north of Rome, to join Alba Longa in a mutual defense pact. Then the Fidenates, Rome's old enemies from across the Tiber. Then several other Latin cities that had watched Rome's aggression and decided that collective defense was smarter than hoping they wouldn't be next. Slowly, carefully, Metius assembled a coalition. Not to attack Rome directly, that would violate the combat's terms and give Tullus justification for total war, but to defend against Roman expansion, to contain Rome's influence, to ensure that Tullus's aggressive kingship didn't spread unchecked. Rome's intelligence network, such as it was, picked up rumors of these alliances. Merchants reported conversations they'd overheard. Travelers mentioned seeing unusual military preparations in Fidenae. Spies sent word that Veii was stockpiling weapons and training soldiers. Tullus called Metius to Rome to explain. The meeting took place in the Forum, public and formal, where everyone could see that Rome was being reasonable and giving Alba Longa opportunity to clarify before assuming the worst. Metius arrived with appropriate ceremony. No large military escort, just enough guards to be respectable, dressed as a diplomat rather than a warrior. He smiled at... "I see," he said. "Thank you for maintaining such excellent discipline. Rome appreciates Alba Longa's strategic positioning." Metius heard the tone and understood that he'd been caught, that Tullus knew, that consequences were coming but not yet. The army returned to Rome, the Albans to their city, both sides preparing for what came next. Knowing the alliance was dead but not yet officially buried, Tullus called the Senate together the day after returning from campaign. "Metius Fufetius betrayed us," he said without preamble, "deliberately failed to engage, watched Romans die, violated every principle of military alliance while maintaining technical compliance with the treaty's letter. We should declare war," one senator said immediately. "We should declare him an enemy of Rome," another added. We should do something more permanent than that, a third voice suggested darkly. Tullus held up his hand for quiet. War with Alba Longa is inevitable. Metius has made that clear. But before we fight them, we need to ensure they can't call on their coalition. We need to isolate them, and we need to make an example that will make other cities think twice before betraying Rome. What do you propose? Proculus asked carefully. We invite Metis back to Rome, Tullus said. We thank him publicly for his excellent service in the Sabine campaign. We celebrate our alliance. We make him feel safe. And then we deal with betrayal the way it deserves to be dealt with, Tullus said. His voice was cold, flat, carrying the particular certainty of someone who'd made a decision and stopped caring about moral complexity. The Senate understood what he was suggesting. Some looked uncomfortable, others nodded approval. Everyone recognized that Rome was about to cross a line from aggressive diplomacy into something darker. Metius received the invitation and suspected it was a trap. But declining would mean admitting guilt, and he wasn't quite ready to make that declaration, so he came to Rome, bringing a small escort, telling himself that Tullus wouldn't risk murdering an allied leader in front of witnesses. He was wrong about that. The celebration took place in the Forum. Appropriate ceremony, speeches thanking Alba Longa for their support, official recognition of the alliance. Metius stood in the centre, smiling, accepting praise while calculating how quickly he could reach his guards if things turned violent. Then Tullus's tone changed. Of course, Tullus said, his voice still friendly but acquiring an edge. Military alliance requires actual military support, not just standing at a distance while allies die. Metius Fufetius, you betrayed Rome. You watched our soldiers fall. You maintained your technical position while violating your actual obligation. Metius's smile froze. His guards reached for weapons but found themselves suddenly surrounded by Roman soldiers who'd been positioned carefully throughout the crowd. The penalty for betrayal, Tullus continued, his voice now completely cold, is death. But not just death. We want everyone to understand what happens when you betray Rome. What happened next was brutal. Deliberately, publicly brutal. Tullus had Metius tied between two chariots, arms to one, legs to another. Then the chariots were driven in opposite directions. The body tore, screaming, blood. The particular horror of death that's meant to be witnessed, that's designed to traumatize observers into compliance. The crowd watched in sick silence. This wasn't battle. This wasn't execution. This was torture made spectacle. Violence as message. Rome demonstrating that betrayal would result in consequences so terrible that they'd be remembered forever. Metius died slowly, horribly, in front of representatives from every allied city who watched and understood that this could be them if they disappointed Rome. Tullus stood unmoved throughout the execution. When it finally ended, when Metius's torn body lay in the Forum with blood pooling on stones that had once hosted Numa's peaceful assemblies, he addressed the crowd. "This is what betrayal costs," Tullus said simply. "Remember it." Then he turned to the Alban representatives, the small delegation that had accompanied Metius to Rome and now stood horrified and trapped. "Alba Longa has violated its alliance repeatedly," Tullus announced. "The combat's terms? Ignored. Military cooperation? Betrayed. Trust? Destroyed. Therefore Rome is withdrawing recognition of Alba Longa as an independent city." Silence. Everyone trying to process what that meant. "In 3 days," Tullus continued, "Rome's army will march to Alba Longa. Not to conquer, you're already conquered. To dismantle. Every building will be destroyed. Every wall torn down. Every citizen will be relocated to Rome. Alba Longa will cease to exist, and everyone who thinks about betraying Rome will remember what happened to the city that tried. The destruction of Alba Longa took a week. Rome's army arrived at the mother city. The city that had given birth to Rome's founders, that had existed for centuries before Rome was even imagined, and systematically destroyed it. They gave the citizens time to pack, allowed them to take possessions, sacred objects, family treasures. Rome wasn't trying to eliminate the Alban people, just the Alban city. The people would be integrated into Rome, given homes on the Caelian hill, allowed to become Roman citizens. It was, in its terrible way, merciful. They could have been slaughtered. Instead, they were being absorbed. But first, the city had to fall. The walls came down stone by stone. Buildings were demolished methodically. The temples, and here Rome showed some restraint, were carefully deconstructed rather than destroyed, with the sacred objects transported to Rome for rededication. Even in conquest, even in rage, Rome remembered that gods noticed how you treated sacred space. The palace where Alban kings had ruled was torn down completely. The market where generations had traded was reduced to rubble. Houses where families had lived for centuries were systematically dismantled. It took a week because Rome wanted witnesses, wanted everyone from the surrounding cities to come and watch as the mother city was erased, wanted the message to be unmistakable. This is what happens when you disappoint us. Tullus walked through the ruins on the final day. Alba Longa had been reduced to rubble and empty foundations, just scattered stones that would eventually be reclaimed by grass and time. In a generation, you'd barely be able to tell a city had existed here. He felt nothing. No triumph, no regret, no moral complexity. Just the cold satisfaction of someone who'd identified a problem and solved it permanently. Numa had accompanied the army. Religious obligations required a priest to oversee the proper transfer of sacred objects. He found Tullus standing in what had once been Alba Longa's main square. "This is patricide," Numa said quietly. "Rome destroying its mother city. The place we came from. Our origin." "This is pragmatism," Tullus replied. "Alba Longa was a threat. Now it's not. Problem solved. The gods will notice." "The gods always notice," Tullus interrupted. "And they'll approve or they won't. But Rome is stronger now, safer. We've demonstrated that betrayal has consequences. That's worth whatever divine displeasure might come." Numa looked at the ruins, at the displaced people streaming toward Rome with their possessions and their grief, at the complete erasure of a city that had existed for centuries. "Numa would have negotiated," he said. "Numa isn't king anymore," Tullus replied. "I am, and I choose different methods. Alba Longa betrayed us repeatedly. Diplomatic solutions don't work on people who lie while smiling. Sometimes you need to remove problems rather than manage them. By destroying an entire city? By removing a threat permanently," Tullus said. "Yes, that's exactly what I'm doing. And it's working. Look at the representatives from the other cities. They're terrified. They're calculating whether opposing Rome is worth the risk. Most will decide it isn't. Alba Longa's destruction just bought us a decade of compliance." He wasn't wrong. The other Latin cities watched Alba Longa disappear and decided that independence wasn't worth that price. Treaties that had been tentative became solid. Alliances that had been theoretical became active. Rome's coalition expanded not through diplomacy, but through terror. Through the understanding that disappointing Tullus Hostilius resulted in consequences too terrible to risk. The Alban refugees arrived in Rome over the next week. Thousands of them, carrying everything they could salvage, looking at the city that had destroyed theirs and trying to decide if this was survival or just slower death. Rome gave them the Caelian Hill, one of the 7 hills, reasonably good land, room to rebuild, gave them citizenship, gave them rights, gave them everything except their city and their independence. It was integration by force, absorption by conquest, growth through destruction. Very Roman, very Tullus, and very, very far from anything Numa would have recognized as civilized governance. That night, Tullus stood in his house and tried to feel something about what he'd done. Tried to summon guilt, or triumph, or moral certainty. Nothing came. Just the flat awareness that he'd solved a problem, that Rome was stronger, that the methods didn't particularly matter as long as the results were good. In the grove beneath the Aventine Hill, Egeria's spring still flowed, still waited for someone to consult it, to ask whether strength through terror was actually strength or just delayed consequence. No one came. No one asked. The spring kept flowing anyway, patient, eternal, knowing that eventually, everyone who ignores wisdom pays for it. The ruins of Alba Longa sat empty under stars that had watched the city's entire existence, and now watched its non-existence. In a few generations, shepherds would graze sheep there, and not even know they were walking through history. Rome had doubled in size, absorbed an entire population, proven it could destroy anything that disappointed it, and in doing so, had become something Numa wouldn't recognize, something Romulus might have appreciated, something that was powerful and terrible, and successful, and completely unsustainable. But that unsustainability wouldn't become obvious for years yet. For now, Rome was simply strong, and strength, Tullus believed, was its own justification. The gods, watching from wherever gods watched from, reserved judgment, or perhaps they were just waiting. Consequences, after all, rarely arrived immediately. They accumulated, compounded, built pressure slowly until the release became inevitable. But Tullus didn't think about consequences. He thought about results. And the results were good. For now. Rome was different now. Bigger, louder, more crowded, more everything. The Alban refugees had brought their families, their trades, their gods, their ways of doing things. They'd settled the Caelian hill and turned it into a neighborhood that looked almost like the city they'd lost. Same architectural styles, same street layouts, same stubborn insistence on maintaining identity, even within absorption. Rome's population had doubled in a matter of weeks, from a city of perhaps 10,000 to one of 20,000, which sounds small by modern standards but felt enormous in the context of 8th century central Italy. Suddenly there weren't enough houses, enough markets, enough temples, enough anything. Tullus handled the expansion with the same aggressive efficiency he brought to everything else. New walls were built encompassing the Caelian hill, new markets were established, new magistrates appointed to handle the increased administrative load. The city creaked and groaned as it adjusted to sudden growth. But it adjusted. The Albans themselves adjusted more slowly. They were Roman citizens now. Officially, legally, completely. But citizenship didn't erase generations of separate identity. They spoke Latin with a slightly different accent. They worshipped the same gods but with different rituals. They looked at Rome's aggressive military culture and remembered when Alba Longa had been peaceful, diplomatic, the kind of city that solved problems through negotiation rather than conquest. There were tensions, small ones, mostly. Alban merchants feeling like they were being excluded from Roman business networks. Roman soldiers looking down on Alban soldiers as defeated enemies rather than fellow citizens. Young people from both groups getting into fights that were technically about personal disputes but actually about which city had the right to exist. Tullus addressed the tensions in the only way he knew how, by giving everyone a common enemy to focus on instead of each other. "We need another war," he announced to the Senate 6 months after Alba Longa's destruction. The senators looked at him with varying expressions of resignation, concern, and in a few cases, enthusiasm. They'd known this was coming. Tullus didn't do peacetime well, never had. He was a hammer that saw every problem as a nail, and right now Rome's internal tensions were a problem that needed hitting. "The Sabines have been raiding our northern borders again," Tullus continued, which was technically true but also extremely exaggerated. "More importantly, we have 20,000 citizens now. Half of them need to learn their Roman, not Alban. The fastest way to build shared identity is shared conflict. Give them a common enemy, common victory, common purpose. Let them bleed together and they'll stop thinking of themselves as separate peoples." It was cynical. It was also probably correct. Nothing builds unity faster than fighting someone else. "We just fought the Sabines," Proculus pointed out, 6 months ago. "The campaign where Metius betrayed us. And now we'll fight them again," Tullus said. "Finish what we started. Push our northern border far enough that the Sabines stop being a recurring problem, and integrate our new Alban citizens by letting them prove themselves in combat. Some of them aren't soldiers. Then they'll learn," Tullus interrupted. "Everyone in Rome should know how to fight. That's how you maintain a city this size in a world this dangerous. You make every citizen a potential soldier." The Senate authorized the campaign, not unanimously. Some senators were starting to worry about Tullus's constant need for conflict, his inability to govern during peace, his transformation of Rome from Numa's religious republic into a permanent military state. But enough senators approved that Tullus had his mandate. Rome mobilized. Again. The Sabine campaign was different from previous wars. Bigger, better organized, more professional. Rome was learning how to be a military state, and the lessons showed. The army that marched north was twice the size of what Romulus could have fielded. Mixed Roman and Alban forces, with careful attention paid to keeping the units integrated. No pure Alban companies, no pure Roman ones. Everyone mixed together, forced to trust each other, forced to become something unified rather than simply adjacent. Tullus commanded from the center, watching for the tensions he'd expected. He found them small frictions, minor disputes, the inevitable clash of military cultures that had developed separately. But he also found something else, the beginning of actual unity. Alban soldiers teaching Romans techniques they'd learned from Alba Longa's older military tradition. Roman soldiers, sharing the aggressive tactics they'd perfected over generations. Both groups discovering they had more in common than they'd thought. War, Tullus noticed, was an excellent teacher. Nothing clarified priorities quite like someone trying to kill you. The Sabines fielded a respectable defense. They'd been raiding Rome for years, knew the terrain, fought with the desperation of people defending their homeland. It should have been a difficult campaign, but Rome was simply better now, more disciplined, more experienced, more willing to accept casualties as necessary costs rather than tragedies to be avoided. The Romans pushed forward methodically, taking territory village by village, establishing permanent fortifications rather than temporary camps. This wasn't a raid. This was annexation. The campaign lasted 4 months. By the end, Rome controlled territory that extended 30 miles north of its previous borders. The Sabines who remained were given a choice: integrate into Rome as the Albans had, or leave for territories beyond Roman control. Most chose integration. Fighting was expensive, and Rome was making it clear that resistance would result in Alba Longa's fate, complete destruction rather than diplomatic compromise. Rome returned victorious. The soldiers, Roman and Alban, both marched through the city together, sharing triumph, sharing the peculiar camaraderie that only forms when you've survived violence alongside people you initially didn't trust. Tullus watched the triumph and felt satisfaction. The Albans were becoming Roman. Not completely, not yet, but the process had begun. In a generation, their children would barely remember Alba Longa. In 2 generations, the distinction would be historical footnote rather than living identity. That was how you built an empire, Tullus thought. Not through diplomacy or alliance, but through absorption. You conquered people, integrated them, gave them enough reason to identify with Rome that they stopped resisting and started contributing. It was brutal. It was effective. It was completely unsustainable without constant expansion. But Tullus didn't see the unsustainability yet. He just saw success. The victories continued. Over the next 5 years, Tullus led Rome through campaigns against the Fidenerts, the Veientes, smaller Latin cities that had supported Alba Longa's coalition, and various tribes that had the misfortune of being close enough to Rome to seem conquerable. Rome grew with each victory. Not dramatically. The city couldn't absorb entire populations constantly, but steadily. New territories were added. New citizens were integrated. New walls were built to encompass the expansion. The character of the city changed. Where Numa's Rome had been quiet, contemplative, organized around sacred time and religious obligation, Tullus's Rome was loud, aggressive, constantly moving. Soldiers everywhere, always training. Merchants doing constant business, supplying the military. Craftsmen making weapons and armor. Everything oriented toward war as the permanent state of existence rather than an occasional interruption of peace. The temples still functioned. The priests still performed their rituals. The Vestals still tended their fire. The Salii still danced. All of Numa's infrastructure remained operational, continuing quietly in the background of Tullus's military state. But the emphasis had shifted completely. Religion happened, but as obligation rather than priority. Festivals occurred, but as breaks from military preparation rather than as the organizing principle of time. The gods were honored, but more as tactical assets than as sources of wisdom or constraint. Numa Marcius watched this transformation with increasing concern. He'd been Pontifex Maximus through Numa's entire reign, and now through 15 years of Tullus's. He'd seen Rome at its most peaceful, and now at its most martial, and he'd noticed something troubling. Tullus had stopped coming to the temples personally. Not completely. He still attended the major festivals, still performed the absolute minimum of royal religious obligations, but the regular consultation with priests, the careful attention to religious detail, the understanding that relationship with the divine required maintenance and couldn't be delegated entirely, that had disappeared. Tullus treated religion like a task to be checked off a list, not a relationship to be cultivated. "You're neglecting the gods," Numa Marcius said to Tullus one afternoon, cornering the king after a Senate meeting. "I'm maintaining the temples," Tullus replied, already moving toward his next obligation, funding the priesthoods, ensuring festivals happen. "What more do you want?" "Personal attention," Numa Marcius said. "The gods notice who honors them directly versus who delegates spiritual obligation to subordinates. You're treating divine relationship like administrative task." "Because I have actual administrative tasks," Tullus said, stopping finally, turning to face the priest with barely concealed impatience. "Rome has doubled in size. We're managing constant expansion. I'm running campaigns, integrating populations, maintaining order across territories that didn't exist a decade ago. I don't have time for extended temple visits and philosophical conversations about sacred duty. You need to make time. No, Tullus interrupted. I need to keep Rome strong. That's my duty. Your duty is maintaining religious infrastructure. We each have our roles. Stop trying to make yours mine. Kings have religious obligations. Kings have whatever obligations actually matter, Tullus said. Numa made religion his priority because that's what he was good at, what he valued, what Rome needed at that moment. I'm making military strength my priority because that's what Rome needs now. Stop trying to make me into Numa. I'm not him. I'll never be him. That's the point. He left before Numa Marcius could respond, already thinking about the next campaign, the next territory to absorb, the next problem to solve through force. Numa Marcius stood in the forum and felt dread settle into his bones. He'd seen this pattern before, not personally, but in the histories he'd studied, the cautionary tales passed down through priestly tradition. Leaders who thought they were too important for divine attention, who believed success validated methods, who confused power with righteousness. It never ended well. The gods had long memories and infinite patience, and they didn't appreciate being treated like optional accessories to human ambition. But Tullus wouldn't listen, was too successful to listen, too certain that his methods worked, that Rome's constant victories proved divine approval, that neglecting personal religious obligation was fine, as long as the priests maintained the infrastructure. He was wrong, but he wouldn't discover that until it was too late. Year 20 of Tullus's reign brought Rome to its greatest extent yet. The city controlled territory from the coast to 30 miles inland, from the Tiber north to the edge of Etruscan influence, from the Alban hills south to where Latin territory gave way to Volscian lands. It was, by the standards of early Rome, enormous. An empire in miniature, a city-state that had grown into a regional power through constant aggression and successful integration. Tullus stood on the Capitoline Hill and looked out over everything Rome controlled. The 7 hills were completely built up now, the valleys between them filling with structures, the walls encompassing territory that would have seemed impossible to Romulus. He felt pride, satisfaction, the particular pleasure of someone who'd set out to accomplish something difficult and had actually done it. Rome was strong. Rome was growing. Rome was becoming the dominant power in central Italy, the city that everyone else organized their politics around, the force that couldn't be ignored. And he'd done that. Not through Numa's patient diplomacy or Romulus's charismatic founding, but through consistent, relentless application of force, through making examples of cities that resisted, through integration of conquered peoples, through transformation of Rome into a military state that could sustain constant expansion. It was working. By every measurable standard, it was working perfectly. The temples still stood. The priests still performed their rituals. The gods were still honored, just not by the king, who should have been honoring them most. But consequences took time to manifest. Divine punishment wasn't immediate. The gods preferred to let humans accumulate hubris, let success breed complacency, let arrogance build until the correction became devastating rather than merely instructive. Tullus didn't know that. He just knew that every campaign succeeded, every expansion worked, every aggressive decision validated itself through results. He was the most successful Roman king since Romulus. Maybe more successful than Romulus, since he'd built on existing strength rather than starting from nothing. The city loved him. The soldiers worshipped him. The conquered peoples feared him. The gods watched, and remembered, and waited. Because Tullus had forgotten the fundamental lesson that Numa had spent 43 years teaching, that Rome didn't belong to its king. Rome belonged to the gods, and kings were just temporary stewards who'd better remember whose city they were actually managing. Tullus had stopped remembering, had stopped caring, had decided that success was its own justification, and that divine approval was demonstrated through victory rather than requiring personal devotion. He was wrong. But he wouldn't understand that until the sickness came. Year 22 brought Rome's first major plague in decades. It started in the crowded Alban quarter. Too many people packed into too little space. Sanitation systems overwhelmed by rapid expansion. The inevitable consequence of doubling population without doubling infrastructure. Someone got sick, then someone else, then dozens, then hundreds. The plague spread through Rome like fire through dry grass. No one knew what caused it. They wouldn't understand disease transmission for another 2,000 years. so no one knew how to stop it. Priests performed purification rituals. Doctors tried various treatments, most of which did nothing or made things worse. People prayed to healing gods and got sick anyway. 10% of Rome died in 3 months. 2,000 people. Gone. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried properly. The smell of funeral pyres became Rome's constant atmosphere. Tullus watched his city suffer and felt the first crack in his certainty. This wasn't an enemy you could fight with soldiers. This wasn't a problem you could solve through force. This was something else entirely, something that required solutions he didn't have. The priests blamed divine displeasure. The gods were angry, they said, because Rome had neglected proper religious observance, because the king treated temples like optional visits rather than sacred obligations, because expansion had been prioritized over spiritual health. "You need to make offerings," Numa said, visiting Tullus in the palace that had been built on the Palatine Hill, larger than Numa's modest house, suitable for a king who ruled an empire. Significant offerings, sacrifices that demonstrate Rome understands its error. "I've been making offerings," Tullus said. He looked exhausted, not from sickness but from stress, from watching his city die and being unable to stop it. "Every god has received sacrifices, multiple sacrifices. What more do you want?" "Personal devotion," Numa said. "Not delegated ritual, but actual attention from the king." The gods noticed the difference between going through motions and genuine reverence. "You've been going through motions for 20 years. I've been keeping Rome strong." "Rome isn't strong if a plague can kill 2,000 citizens in 3 months," Numa interrupted. "Strength isn't just military power, it's also spiritual health, proper relationship with the divine, the understanding that we don't control everything and need help from powers beyond ourselves." Tullus wanted to argue, wanted to maintain that his methods were correct, that the plague was just unfortunate circumstance, that divine displeasure wasn't real, and priests were just using crisis to regain influence they'd lost to military priorities. But 2,000 bodies said otherwise. 2,000 funerals said that maybe, possibly, he'd made a mistake somewhere. "What do the gods want?" he asked finally, his voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd run out of solutions. "I don't know," Numa admitted. "That's what you'd discover if you consulted them properly. If you visited temples personally, performed rituals with attention, asked for guidance instead of just assuming you knew better." "I'm not Numa," Tullus said. "I can't spend my days in groves talking to springs." "You don't have to be Numa," replied. "You just have to be someone who remembers that the gods matter, that they're not optional accessories to human ambition, that Rome exists with divine permission, not through royal force alone." He left. Tullus sat in his palace and looked at reports of plague deaths and tried to decide if he believed any of this. 20 years of success suggested divine approval. 2,000 deaths suggested divine punishment. Which was real? Which should he trust? He didn't know. And for the first time since becoming king, he felt genuinely uncertain about what to do next. Outside, the funeral pyres kept burning, Rome kept dying, the gods kept watching, and somewhere in a grove beneath the Aventine Hill, a spring kept flowing, patient, eternal, waiting for someone to remember it existed and ask for help. But no one came. Not yet. The plague lasted 6 months before finally burning itself out. Not because anyone did anything right, because diseases run their course and populations develop resistance, and eventually even the most virulent infections exhaust themselves. Rome survived, diminished, traumatized, but intact. The city had lost nearly 3,000 citizens by the time the dying stopped, 15% of the population, including some of Rome's most skilled craftsmen, several prominent senators, and one of the 6 Vestal virgins. The Vestal's death was particularly disturbing. They were supposed to be protected, sacred, immune, maintained by divine favor because of their service. If a Vestal could die of plague, then either the gods weren't protecting Rome, or Rome had done something so wrong that even the sacred became vulnerable. Numa performed the funeral personally. The remaining 5 Vestals stood in their white robes and mourned their sister while Rome watched and wondered what it meant when holiness couldn't protect you from disease. Tullus attended the funeral, because royal obligation required it. He stood at the back, uncomfortable with religious ceremony as always, thinking about population recovery strategies and how long before Rome could resume expansion. "You're not paying attention," a voice said quietly beside him. Tullus turned to find an old priest. Ancient, actually, one of the original appointees from Numa's time, somehow still alive despite being perhaps 90 years old. His name was Egeria, which was also the name of Numa's spring goddess, and there'd always been jokes about whether he was named for her or she for him, or if perhaps they were the same entity wearing different shapes. "I'm here," Tullus said. "That's paying attention." "You're present," the old priest corrected. "That's not the same thing. Paying attention means understanding what this death means. A Vestal died, one of 6 women whose entire purpose is maintaining Rome's sacred fire, its connection to the eternal. That's not random, that's message. From whom? From whatever power maintains the universe when humans stop paying attention," the priest said. "Some call them gods, some call them fate. Names don't matter. What matters is that Rome has been ignoring them, and they're reminding us they exist. Through killing a Vestal." Tullus kept his voice quiet, mindful of the ceremony, but his skepticism was clear. "That seems unnecessarily cruel for supposedly benevolent divine powers." "Who said they were benevolent?" The old priest smiled without humor. "The gods aren't good or evil, they're just powerful, and they don't appreciate being treated as optional. You've been treating them as optional for 22 years. I maintain the temples. You delegate maintenance to people you hired," the priest interrupted. "That's not the same as personal devotion. Kings have obligations beyond administration, spiritual obligations, relationship obligations. The gods want attention from the person who claims authority over their city. When that person treats them like bureaucratic formalities, they remind him that they're not. Through plague," Tullus said flatly. "Through whatever gets the message across," the priest replied. "Usually disaster. That's how divine communication works. Subtle until ignored, then increasingly unsubtle until someone finally pays attention." The funeral ceremony concluded. The Vestal's body was committed to fire, her ashes to be preserved in the temple she'd served. The crowd dispersed slowly, reluctantly, carrying the weight of loss and uncertainty. Tullus started to leave, but the old priest caught his arm with surprising strength for someone so ancient. "One more thing," the priest said. "Numa used to visit the grove, the one beneath the Aventine hill where Egeria's spring flows. He'd consult her every few days, ask for guidance, listen to wisdom that came from something older than ambition. You've never gone there, not once in 22 years. "I don't talk to springs," Tullus said. "Maybe you should start," the priest replied, "before the gods escalate from killing Vestals to killing kings." He let go of Tullus's arm and walked away, moving with the careful deliberation of the very old disappearing into the crowd before Tullus could respond. Tullus stood in the forum and tried to decide if that had been advice, warning, or threat. Probably all three. The plague's end didn't bring relief, just exhausted numbness. Rome had survived, but the city felt hollowed out. Empty spaces where people should be, businesses closed because their owners had died, children who'd lost parents, parents who'd lost children. The particular grief that comes from mass death when loss becomes so common it stops feeling exceptional and starts feeling normal. Tullus tried to govern through it, tried to maintain order, keep the city functioning, plan for recovery. But something had shifted. The certainty he'd carried for 20 years, the belief that force and success were the same thing, that winning validated methods, that strength proved righteousness, that had cracked. Not broken, not yet, but cracked enough that doubt could seep through. He started having trouble sleeping. Would lie awake thinking about the Vestal's death, about the old priest's warning, about whether divine displeasure was real, or just a story people told themselves to make random tragedy feel meaningful. 3,000 dead. That wasn't message, that was just disease. Terrible, tragic, but ultimately natural. No different from when storms destroyed crops or wolves attacked flocks. The world was dangerous and people died, and looking for divine intent in every disaster was just humans needing patterns where none existed. That's what Tullus told himself. But the telling didn't help him sleep. 2 months after the plague ended, he got sick himself. It started small, a cough that wouldn't clear, fatigue that lasted longer each day. Nothing dramatic, just the slow awareness that his body was failing in ways he couldn't control. The doctors examined him and found nothing obviously wrong. No plague symptoms. This was something else, something chronic rather than acute. something that drained energy and vitality without killing quickly enough to be merciful. "You need rest," the doctors said. "I need to govern," Tullus replied. "You need rest," they repeated more firmly. "Whatever this is, it's not improving. Your body is telling you to stop. You should listen." But Tullus didn't know how to stop. Stopping meant admitting weakness, meant acknowledging that success had limits, meant facing the possibility that maybe the old priest was right, maybe the gods were sending message through illness, maybe neglecting divine relationship had consequences beyond just priestly complaints. He tried to continue as normal, attended Senate meetings, reviewed military reports, made decisions about governance and expansion, but the effort exhausted him more each day. By afternoon, he could barely stay upright. By evening, he was collapsed in bed, wondering if he'd wake up the next morning. The illness progressed slowly over months. Not killing him, just making him progressively more useless, transforming the warrior king into a sick old man who spent his days in bed, trying to pretend he was still capable of ruling. Rome noticed. The Senate started making decisions without consulting him. The military commanders operated independently. The city continued functioning, but without Tullus at its center, without his aggressive energy driving everything forward. And Rome discovered something interesting. It didn't actually need a warrior king every moment. The systems worked. The administration functioned. Military campaigns could proceed under competent commanders. The city Tullus had built was stable enough to run itself for a while, which made his illness feel even more meaningless. If Rome didn't need him constantly, then what had all the effort been for? What had 22 years of relentless expansion accomplished if the city could operate fine without him? Numa visited Tullus 6 months into the illness. Found the king in his palace bedroom, surrounded by medical equipment and worried attendants, looking like a pale shadow of the aggressive warrior who'd terrified Alba Longa into submission. "You're dying," Numa said. Not cruelly, just stating observable fact. "I'm sick," Tullus corrected. "That's different. You've been sick for 6 months, and you're not improving. The doctors have tried everything. Nothing works. You're dying slowly, but you're still dying." Tullus wanted to argue, but couldn't summon the energy. "What do you want me to say? That I regret not spending more time in temples? That I should have consulted springs and taken goddess advice seriously? That the gods are punishing me for prioritizing Rome's strength over religious performance? I want you to say you understand," Numa replied. "That relationship with the divine isn't optional. That success doesn't validate neglect. That Rome exists with divine permission, and when kings forget that, consequences follow. So this is punishment?" Tullus gestured weakly at his failing body. "Divine retribution for not being Numa?" "This is correction," Numa said. "Reminder that power has limits, that humans don't control everything, that the gods matter whether you believe in them or not. But I maintained everything. The temples, the priesthoods, the festivals. You delegated everything." Numa interrupted gently, "Which isn't the same as participating. The gods want relationship, not administration. They want kings who remember that Rome belongs to them, not to whoever temporarily sits on the throne. You forgot that. This is the reminder." Tullus lay in bed and tried to accept what he was hearing, tried to believe that his illness was divine message rather than just random misfortune, tried to find meaning in suffering that felt meaningless. "What do I do?" he asked finally. "How do I fix this?" "You can't," Numa said. "Not completely. The relationship you neglected for 22 years can't be repaired in 22 days. But you can try. You can acknowledge error. You can make offerings with actual devotion instead of obligatory performance. You can ask forgiveness instead of assuming you deserve divine favor because you made Rome strong. And that will cure me?" "Probably not," Numa admitted. "But it might ease your death, make the transition less terrifying, help you understand that you're not just sick, you're being taught something important in your final months." "What lesson?" Tullus asked. "That I was wrong? That everything I did for Rome was a mistake? That Numa's approach was correct and mine was prideful rebellion? The lesson," Numa said patiently, "is that Rome needs both. Numa's peace built spiritual foundation. Your strength built military power. Both were necessary. Both served Rome. The mistake wasn't being different from Numa. The mistake was thinking your difference meant you could ignore what he established. Thinking strength exempted you from spiritual obligation. Thinking the gods cared about results more than relationship." He stood to leave, then paused at the door. There's still the grove, he said, beneath the Aventine hill. Numa used to visit it constantly. Maybe you should go, even once, even if you don't believe it matters, just to say you tried everything before the end. Then he left, and Tullus was alone with his illness and his doubts and the growing certainty that he was going to die without understanding whether any of this had meaning beyond the simple fact that bodies fail and kings are mortal. Tullus didn't go to the grove immediately. Pride prevented it. The warrior king who'd conquered half of Latium wasn't going to crawl to a spring and beg forgiveness in his final days. That would mean admitting defeat, not to enemies, but to something worse, to the possibility that he'd been wrong about fundamental things. He spent another month deteriorating, growing weaker, accepting that recovery wasn't coming, making peace with mortality in the way humans do. Slowly, reluctantly, with constant backsliding into denial. Finally, on a grey afternoon when his attendants had briefly left him alone, Tullus decided he had nothing left to lose. If consulting a spring was meaningless, then it cost nothing but effort. If it wasn't meaningless, then maybe it would provide something useful. Closure, if not cure. He got out of bed. The effort nearly destroyed him. His legs barely held weight. His vision blurred. But he'd spent 22 years being strong, being capable, being the person who solved problems through force of will. He could manage one last journey. The grove was only a few hundred yards away. It took Tullus half an hour to reach it. He had to stop frequently, rest, gather strength for the next section. By the time he arrived, he was exhausted beyond anything he'd experienced in combat. The spring was exactly as described. Water flowing over mossy stones, oak trees providing shade, the kind of quiet that felt older than human history. Tullus lowered himself carefully to the ground beside the water and tried to figure out what you were supposed to do when consulting goddesses in groves. "I don't know how this works," he said finally, speaking to water and trees and silence. Numa did this regularly. He understood, whatever this is. I don't. I'm a soldier. I solve problems through force. I don't talk to springs. The water kept flowing. Patient, eternal, unimpressed by royal uncertainty. But I'm dying, Tullus continued. And everyone says it's because I neglected you, or the gods you represent, or the spiritual obligations I was supposed to maintain. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if you exist, or if I'm talking to water that doesn't care. But I'm here, finally, trying. Still no response. Just flowing water and rustling leaves, and the particular stillness that sacred spaces maintain. I'm sorry, Tullus said, and was surprised to find he meant it. For ignoring this, for treating divine relationship as optional bureaucracy, for thinking strength was sufficient, for being so certain I was right that I stopped checking whether I was wrong. The spring continued its eternal motion. If Aguria heard, she gave no sign. If she cared, she didn't demonstrate it in ways Tullus could recognize. He sat by the water until sunset, growing colder, growing weaker, waiting for guidance or wisdom, or at least acknowledgement that he'd tried. Nothing came, just water and trees, and the slow approach of night. Finally exhausted, Tullus stood to leave, paused, looked back at the spring. "Thank you," he said, "for listening. If you listened, for existing, if you exist, for being patient with kings who forget you're here." Then he made the long, difficult journey back to his palace, collapsed into bed, and waited for whatever came next. He didn't receive healing, didn't receive forgiveness, didn't receive any obvious sign that his visit to the grove mattered. But something shifted anyway. Some internal weight that had been pressing down for months eased slightly. Not physically, his body continued failing, but spiritually, mentally, the acceptance that maybe he'd been wrong, maybe his certainty had been arrogance, maybe the gods deserved more attention than he'd given them. It didn't cure him, but it let him stop fighting death quite so desperately. Let him acknowledge that his time was ending, and that was acceptable. Let him release the grip on power and control, and the belief that strength solved everything. Tullus Hostilius, warrior king, learned humility. He learned it too late to change anything, too late to govern differently, too late to avoid divine correction. But he learned it, and that perhaps was the point. And the end came on a spring morning. that felt like the world holding its breath. Tullus had been confined to bed for weeks now, too weak to stand, too exhausted to do anything beyond exist. The illness had progressed from chronic fatigue to something more comprehensive, his body systematically shutting down, organs failing one by one, the kind of death that gave you time to watch yourself disappear. Rome had moved on without him. The Senate governed. The military conducted campaigns. Life continued with the easy momentum of systems that had become self-sustaining. Tullus watched from his bedroom window as the city he'd built kept functioning, kept growing, kept being Rome regardless of whether its king was conscious or capable. It should have been satisfying. Proof that his work had created something lasting, that Rome no longer needed constant royal intervention to survive. Instead, it felt hollow. 22 years of relentless effort, and the main accomplishment was making himself unnecessary. Numa visited frequently during those final weeks. Not to lecture anymore, there was no point, but to sit with Tullus in the quiet hours and talk about things beyond politics and conquest and the endless pursuit of strength. Numa spent his final years at peace, Tullus said during one of these visits. His voice was thin now, barely more than whisper. He'd built everything he wanted to build, established everything he meant to establish. He died knowing his work was complete. And you? Numa asked gently. I have no idea if my work is complete, Tullus admitted. I built Rome into a regional power, doubled its size, made it something that neighbors fear and allies respect. But I don't know if that was what Rome needed, or just what I wanted to do. I don't know if I served Rome, or just served my own need to be useful through force. Both, probably, Numa said. Most kings serve themselves and their city simultaneously. The question isn't whether your motives were pure. No one's are. The question is whether Rome is better for your reign or just bigger. What's the difference? Better means sustainable. Means the growth you forced can be maintained by whoever comes next. Means you built foundation, not just expansion. Bigger just means bigger, which is impressive but not necessarily good. Tullus thought about that, about Alba Longa destroyed, about populations forcibly integrated, about a military state that required constant conquest to justify its own existence, about whether any of that would last once the momentum stopped. I think I made Rome bigger, he said finally. I'm not sure I made it better. That's honest, at least. Numa replied. Most kings die believing they were perfect. You're dying with clarity about your limitations. That's something. It was small comfort, but it was something. The final week, Tullus began having dreams. Not normal dreams. Fever dreams, probably, brought on by failing organs and the body's increasingly desperate attempts to maintain consciousness. But they felt real, more real than reality sometimes, like glimpses of something beyond the immediate moment. He dreamed of Alba Longa, as it had been before Rome destroyed it. Beautiful city and beautiful hills, older than Rome, wiser in some ways. He saw citizens going about their lives, trading, talking, raising children, living. Then he saw Roman soldiers arriving, saw the systematic destruction, saw families fleeing with whatever they could carry, saw the ruins after. Empty foundations, scattered stones, the complete erasure of a city that had existed for centuries. In the dream, the ruins spoke. Not with voices exactly, more like understanding that appeared in his mind fully formed. You did this, for a boundary dispute, for a cow, for pride disguised as strength. You erased us because we disappointed you. You betrayed us. Tullus said in the dream. Metius betrayed us. The alliance was violated, and you responded by murdering an entire city. Not conquering, not defeating, murdering. You made an example of us to terrify everyone else into compliance. That wasn't strength. That was cruelty called strategy. Tullus woke from that dream covered in sweat, shaking, unable to escape the image of Alba Longa's empty ruins, and the understanding that maybe he'd gone too far. Maybe there had been other options. Maybe total destruction hadn't been the only response to betrayal. Maybe he'd chosen it because it sent the best message, not because it was just. The next night, he dreamed of Horatia, not the woman who died in the street, the child she'd been before everything went wrong. He saw her playing with her brothers, laughing, completely unaware that her future would end in blood and cursing. She looked at him in the dream and said, "You let my brother murder me," and called it justice. You let Rome celebrate violence as patriotism. You made grief illegal and loyalty mandatory. Do you think the gods noticed? The people voted, Tullus said weakly. Rome decided Publius was justified. Rome decided what was convenient. What let them keep their champion while pretending they still had morals? You could have stopped it. You could have said murder is murder regardless of who commits it. But you wanted the political benefit of keeping your hero more than you wanted actual justice. He woke from that dream too, understanding with terrible clarity that Horatia had been right to curse them, that Rome had chosen power over principle, that he'd enabled that choice because it served his purposes. The dreams continued. Different scenes, different people, but always the same message. You broke things that didn't need breaking. You prioritized strength over everything else. You forgot that power without restraint becomes tyranny, that success without ethics becomes monstrosity, that kings serve more than just ambition. On his final day, Tullus decided to try one more time to honor the gods properly. He called for Numa and the other senior priests, asked them to bring everything necessary for a major sacrifice to Jupiter, the kind of elaborate ceremony that required precise ritual, specific prayers, careful attention to every detail. "I want to do this correctly," Tullus said. His voice was barely audible now. "Whatever I neglected for 22 years, I want to correct it. Even if it's too late, even if it changes nothing, I want to try." The priests brought everything to his bedroom. Couldn't move Tullus to a temple, so they'd bring the temple to him. They set up a portable altar, brought the sacrificial animal, prepared the sacred implements, made everything as correct as circumstances allowed. Tullus tried to perform the ceremony himself, tried to speak the prayers, make the offerings, demonstrate personal devotion rather than delegated obligation. But his hands shook too much to hold the ritual knife. His voice was too weak to recite the prayers correctly. His memory, fading now, couldn't recall the precise words that mattered so much to proper ceremony. He made mistakes. Multiple mistakes. Got the order wrong, used incorrect phrasing, performed gestures incompletely. The priests tried to help, to guide him through it, to make the ceremony valid despite his errors. But sacred ritual required precision, required correct performance, required the kind of attention Tullus had never quite managed when he was healthy, and certainly couldn't manage now. The sacrifice failed. Not dramatically. The animal died. The blood was spilled. The forms were followed approximately. But anyone who understood religious ceremony could see it wasn't right, wasn't proper, wasn't the kind of devotion that actually honored gods rather than just going through motions. Tullus collapsed back into bed, exhausted by the effort, understanding that he'd tried and failed even at this final attempt to correct his neglect. "I'm sorry," he whispered to whatever gods were listening. "I'm sorry I was never good at this. I'm sorry I thought it didn't matter. I'm sorry I realized too late that it did." Numa stood beside the bed and felt profound sadness. Not for Tullus specifically, the king had made his choices and lived with consequences, but for the wasted potential. If Tullus had balanced his military strength with spiritual attention, if he'd maintained relationship with the divine while building Rome's power, he could have been remembered as Rome's greatest king. Instead, he'd be remembered as the warrior who forgot the gods, the conqueror who died slowly while his city moved on without him. A cautionary tale more than a celebration. The storm arrived at sunset. Not metaphorical storm, actual weather. Thunder rolling across the 7 hills. Clouds gathering with unnatural speed. The kind of atmospheric violence that made even skeptics wonder if divine powers were paying attention. Tullus heard the thunder and understood, with the clarity of impending death, that this was answer. Not to his failed sacrifice specifically, but to everything. To 22 years of neglect. To the assumption that strength excused spiritual obligation. To treating the gods as optional accessories rather than the actual authorities over Rome's existence. The thunder grew louder, closer. The room darkened as storm clouds blocked the failing light. Wind picked up, rattling the palace windows, making the walls creak with pressure. Numa and the other priests backed toward the door, instinct telling them to leave, that whatever was coming was meant for the king alone. "Stay," Tullus said, or tried to say. His voice was barely sound anymore. But they heard the intention and stayed, standing against the walls, witnesses to whatever happened next. Lightning struck close, very close. The palace shook. Another strike, then another. The storm was centered directly over Tullus's bedroom, impossibly focused, clearly targeting something specific. "Jupiter," Numa whispered. "Not prayer, just recognition." the king of gods making his opinion known about the king of Rome who'd forgotten him. Tullus tried to sit up, couldn't, tried to speak some final words, some acknowledgement of what was happening. But death and storm both moved faster than his ability to respond. The lightning struck the palace directly, not near it, through the roof, through the ceiling, directly into Tullus's bedroom with the kind of precision that left no doubt this was aimed rather than random. The room exploded in light and sound, and the particular smell of air being ripped apart by more energy than it could contain. Fire erupted immediately. The bed, the walls, everything combustible catching simultaneously. The priests fled. Had to staying meant burning. They stumbled out of the room, out of the palace, into the forum where Rome had gathered to watch the storm, and they saw the palace burning with unnatural intensity, flames rising higher than seemed possible from normal fire. Tullus Hostilius died in those flames, instantly probably struck by lightning before the fire could take him. Small mercy that. A quick death rather than burning alive. The palace burned through the night. By morning nothing remained but foundation stones and ash, and the scattered evidence that Rome's third king had died exactly how prophets and priests had warned he would, struck down by the very god he'd neglected most consistently, Jupiter, king of gods, protector of Rome, who had watched Tullus expand Roman territory, strengthen Roman military, build Roman power, and who had apparently decided that none of that excused the fundamental disrespect of treating divine relationship as optional bureaucracy. Rome woke to ruins, and the smell of burning, and the understanding that their warrior king was dead, killed by the gods he'd spent 22 years treating as less important than military conquest. The message was unmistakable, unavoidable. Written in lightning and fire and the complete destruction of the palace where Tullus had lived and governed and forgotten to maintain the relationships that actually mattered. The Senate met the next day in somber emergency session. They needed to choose Rome's fourth king, but first they needed to understand what had just happened and what it meant for how Rome should be governed going forward. The gods killed him. Numa said simply, for neglecting them, for treating sacred obligation as less important than military expansion, for forgetting that Rome exists with divine permission. Or lightning struck the palace randomly, a skeptical senator suggested. And we're attaching meaning to coincidence because that's what humans do. Lightning struck with perfect aim during a storm that appeared from nowhere. Numa replied, on the exact day Tullus tried and failed to perform proper ceremony to Jupiter. That's not coincidence, that's message. Then what's the message? Proculus asked. He was very old now, had served under 3 kings, had seen Rome transform from Numa's peaceful republic to Tullus's military state. What are we supposed to learn from this? Balance, Numa said. Numa built religious foundation but neglected military strength. Tullus built military strength but neglected religious foundation. Rome needs both. The next king needs to understand that power and piety aren't opposites. They're partners. You can't maintain one while completely ignoring the other. The Senate discussed for hours, debated who should follow Tullus, what qualities Rome needed, how to honor both aspects of governance rather than emphasizing one at the expense of the other. They chose carefully, deliberately, learning, finally, from the mistakes of their kings rather than just repeating them. But that's a story for another episode. For now, Rome mourned its third king and tried to understand what 22 years of aggressive expansion had accomplished and cost. The temples still stood, Numa's legacy, maintained even through Tullus's neglect. The territories still existed, Tullus's legacy acquired through relentless conquest. Rome was larger, stronger, more powerful than it had been when Tullus took the throne. But 3,000 citizens had died in plague. Alba Longa was erased, Horatia was murdered, and the king himself had died screaming in flames while the god he'd neglected demonstrated the cost of divine displeasure. Was it worth it? Had the expansion justified the cost? Had Rome become better or just bigger? The city would spend generations trying to answer those questions, would build on both legacies, Numa's peaceful structures and Tullus's aggressive expansion, trying to find the balance that had eluded both kings individually. In the grove beneath the Aventine hill, Egeria's spring kept flowing. Tullus had visited once, too late, with too little faith. But he'd visited, had tried, in his fumbling warrior way, to acknowledge what he'd neglected. The spring remembered, would remember all of Rome's kings, all their attempts at wisdom, all their failures and occasional successes, would flow through centuries and empires, and the eventual fall of everything Rome would become. patient, eternal, unimpressed by human drama, but willing to witness it anyway. Tullus Hostilius was gone, reduced to ash and memory and cautionary tale, the warrior king who forgot that strength alone wasn't enough, who built an empire and lost his soul, who learned humility exactly one day too late to do anything useful with it. Rome would remember him, not as fondly as Romulus, not as warmly as Numa, but importantly, significantly, as the king who showed them what happened when you chose only one kind of strength and forgot that civilizations required multiple kinds to survive. The fire in the palace had finally been extinguished. The ruins were cooling, the ash was settling, and somewhere in that ash, buried under collapsed ceilings and burned furniture, and the remnants of royal ambition, was a body that had once been the most powerful man in central Italy, reduced to nothing, like everyone eventually. The thunder had returned, had spoken, had delivered judgment, and Rome, watching the ruins smoke in the morning light, understood that some lessons could only be learned through destruction. That power without restraint became disaster. That kings who forgot the gods died in ways that everyone remembered. The spring flowed, the seasons turned, life continued, and Rome, forever changed by both peace and war, by temples and conquest, by Numa's patience and Tullus's aggression, prepared for whatever came next, hoping perhaps that the next king would find the balance that had proven so impossible for the previous two, hoping that Rome had learnt enough to survive its own strength, hoping that the gods were patient enough to give them another chance. The thunder faded, the storm passed, the morning brightened, and Rome began again. The ashes cooled, the smoke cleared. Rome stood in the aftermath of lightning and tried to understand what it had witnessed. Tullus Hostilius had ruled for 32 years, built Rome from a single city into a regional power, doubled its population, tripled its territory, made it something that neighbors feared and couldn't ignore. He'd been everything Numa wasn't, aggressive where Numa was patient, martial where Numa was contemplative, certain where Numa was careful, and he'd died screaming in flames while Jupiter demonstrated what happened when kings forgot whose city they were actually managing. The temples Numa built still stood. The territories Tullus conquered still belonged to Rome. Both legacies remained, waiting for whoever came next to decide how to balance them, how to be both strong and spiritual, how to honor gods while also defending borders. Rome had learnt something essential through its first 3 kings. Romulus showed them how to begin, how to take nothing and build something through sheer audacity and violence. Numa showed them how to sustain, how to give that something structure and meaning in connection to powers beyond human ambition. Tullus showed them the limits, how strength alone eventually consumed itself, how power without restraint became its own punishment. 3 kings, 3 approaches, 3 lessons about what it meant to be Rome. The 4th king would have to synthesize all of it, would have to understand that Rome needed temples and armies, priests and soldiers, sacred time and military discipline, that you couldn't choose just one aspect and ignore the others. That civilization required multiple kinds of strength working together rather than competing. But that's tomorrow's story. Tonight, Rome mourns, buries its dead king, what little remained of him, honors what he accomplished while acknowledging what it cost, tries to learn from his mistakes without dismissing his successes. The fire burns low in our hearth now. The candles gutter. Outside, night has settled completely over the 7 hills. Tullus Hostilius, warrior king, conqueror, the man who made Rome powerful and forgot to make it wise, who built an empire and lost his soul, who learned too late that the gods cared less about what you conquered than about whether you remembered to honor them while conquering. Rome would not forget this lesson, would carry it forward through centuries of expansion and eventual empire, would remember that power required balance, that strength needed spiritual foundation, that kings who forgot the divine died in memorable ways. The thunder had spoken, the message was delivered, and Rome, forever changed by both peace and war, prepared for whatever came next. The spring still flows, the seasons still turn, the story continues. But for tonight, Tullus Hostilius rests in ash and memory. His 32 years compressed into cautionary tale, his strength remembered alongside his blindness, his legacy both warning and inspiration for all the kings and emperors who would follow. Sleep well. The story of Rome continues, but Tullus's part in it has ended. As all parts end, eventually, even for kings, the embers glow softly. Another Roman night settles, another king's story told. Thank you for being here, for spending these hours with Tullus Hostilius and his complicated legacy. If you enjoyed this journey through Rome's warrior king, please subscribe to continue the story. We're building Rome king by king, century by century, from mythological founding to empire's fall. New episodes weekly, each one designed for sleep, study, or deep relaxation while history unfolds at its own patient pace. Next time, Ancus Marcius, Rome's fourth king. The one who had to balance everything his predecessors couldn't. War and peace, expansion and consolidation, temples and bridges. The king who tried to be both Numa and Tullus, and discovered how difficult that actually was. Until then, rest well. Let Rome's ancient stories accompany your sleep. The fire fades, the night deepens, and the story continues, waiting for you whenever you're ready to return.